Hey friends, glad you're here at LUMOUS. What if? We've cooked up something special. Harry screamed during first-year checkup, and St. Mungo's healers discovered 400 dark curses covering every bone in his body. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1. The Screaming the Waiting Room at St. Mungo's hospital for magical maladies and injuries smelled like antiseptic potion and old magazines. And on a Tuesday morning in November of 1981, it was packed with the particular kind of chaos that follows a war. Not the dramatic chaos of battles and explosions that had ended 2 weeks ago, on Halloween night, when something happened in Godric's Hollow that nobody fully understood yet. This was the quieter, uglier aftermath chaos. Witches with hex burns that hadn't healed right. Wizards whose memories had been obliterated by retreating Death Eaters and hadn't come back properly. A young woman in the corner who kept flinching at sounds that weren't there. A man with no left hand who was reading the Daily Prophet with the focused concentration of someone trying very hard not to think about anything. Petunia Dursley sat in the middle of all of it looking like she'd accidentally wandered into a different dimension, which, in a meaningful sense, she had. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman with a neck that stretched slightly longer than average and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging every peculiar thing in the room and finding it deeply offensive. She had dressed carefully that morning, pressed blouse, sensible shoes, hair pinned back because Petunia Dursley faced things she didn't understand by presenting the most aggressively normal version of herself possible. It was armor. It had always been armor. In her arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was Harry. He was 14 months old and sleeping, which was the only time he looked fully peaceful. Dark hair, already a disaster of cowlicks. His father's face in miniature, which Petunia noticed every time she looked at him and felt a complicated twist of emotion she refused to examine. He had a scar on his forehead, lightning bolt shaped, still faintly pink, that she'd taken to covering with the edge of his blanket when they went out, because people kept staring at it and she couldn't stand being stared at. She didn't want to be here. She'd made that clear to the letter that arrived yesterday morning, a piece of parchment that had sailed through her kitchen window despite it being closed and landed in her cornflakes. The letter had been brief and professional and absolutely non-negotiable in tone, informing her that Harry James Potter was due for his standard one-year diagnostic checkup, and that given his unusual circumstances, that was the phrase they'd used, unusual circumstances, as though it was a perfectly normal thing to write. The appointment had been arranged for Tuesday at 9, and transport would be provided. The transport had been a portkey disguised as a bus ticket. Petunia had held it between 2 fingers like it might bite her, then grabbed Harry and touched it, and the world had dissolved. She hated magic. She hated all of this. She wanted to be home. Harry stirred in her arms, made a small sound, and she automatically adjusted her grip. He settled. She stared at the wall. Across the room, a healer in lime green robes appeared through a door and called a name. The man with no left hand folded his prophet and stood. Petunia watched him go and then looked back down at the sleeping baby and thought, not for the first time, what am I supposed to do with you? She didn't have an answer. She hadn't had one for 2 weeks. Miriam Thorne had been a diagnostic healer at St. Mungo's for 19 years, which meant she had seen a genuinely extraordinary range of terrible things happen to the human body via magical means. She had treated transfiguration accidents and potions disasters and curse damage, ranging from mild to catastrophic. She had diagnosed a wizard in 1974 who had somehow managed to get a fully functional beehive inside his liver. She had, on 3 separate occasions, treated injuries caused by people attempting to modify their own apparition while drunk. She was not, in short, a woman who startled easily. She was 51 years old. With gray-streaked brown hair, she kept cut practically short and reading glasses she'd been meaning to get magically corrected for 6 years. She had steady hands, a methodical mind, and the specific kind of calm authority that came not from rank, but from the simple fact that she was nearly always the most competent person in the room and had largely made her peace with that. She pulled Harry Potter's file as she walked to the family consultation room, reading as she went. Standard one-year checkup. referred by the ministry's Magical Child Welfare Office. That was unusual. Muggle guardians usually went through different channels, flagged for diagnostic priority. No medical history beyond birth records, parents deceased, guardian Muggle aunt. She paused outside the door and reread that last part, parents deceased. James and Lily Potter. She'd read about them in the Prophet like everyone else. The whole world had been reading about their son for 2 weeks. The boy who lived. The child who'd somehow survived the killing curse, which was, as every healer she knew kept saying to each other in low, bewildered voices, impossible. The killing curse didn't leave survivors. The killing curse left corpses. That was its entire biological function. She took a breath, straightened her robes, and knocked once before opening the door. The Muggle woman looked up from the chair with the expression of someone who had been sitting very stiffly in a room they hated for 20 minutes. The baby in her arms was awake now, blinking at Miriam with large green eyes that were startlingly vivid, not just green but vivid, the color of something alive. Mrs. Dursley, Miriam said, keeping her voice warm and professional in equal measure. I'm Healer Thorne, thank you for coming in. I didn't have much choice, Petunia said, and there was a layer under the sharpness that Miriam, who was good at reading people, recognized as fear. No, I suppose not, I'm sorry about that. She sat in the chair across from them and opened her folder. This is Harry, yes. The baby looked at her steadily. Miriam looked back. There was something in those eyes that made her feel briefly and inexplicably like she was being assessed. She dismissed the feeling. He was 14 months old and smiled at him. He didn't smile back. He tilted his head slightly. Right, she said. How has he been? Any concerns? Sleeping, eating, development? Petunia's mouth pressed into a thin line. He's fine. He doesn't sleep through the night. He eats. He's walking. Early. He started pulling himself up at 8 months and was walking properly by 10. She said this the way she said most things about Harry, with a slightly pained inflection, as though the information was inconvenient. He doesn't say much, a few words, but he watches everything. Miriam noted this down. Early walking, limited verbal output, high environmental awareness. Not unusual, she thought, though she did glance again at those eyes. Has he shown any, she chose the word carefully, unusual responses? Anything that startled you? A beat of silence. He makes things move, Petunia said, clipped and fast, like she'd been holding it in and wanted it out quickly. Not often, when he's upset. Things just shift, the cups on the counter, once a chair moved. I can't, she stopped. He's one of them, isn't he? Like his mother was. I always knew he would be. It sounds like accidental magic, yes, Miriam said, keeping her voice even. That's perfectly normal in magical children. It's not dangerous, Mrs. Dursley. He can't control it yet. Petunia looked like she strongly disagreed about the not dangerous part but said nothing. All right, Miriam set down her quill and stood. I'm going to run a standard diagnostic scan. If you could place him on the examination table. There, yes, just lay him down. Harry went onto the padded table and looked up at the ceiling, and then sideways at Miriam with that same unsettling steadiness. She picked up her wand. The standard diagnostic charm for magical children was a modified version of Corporeus Revelo. It checked bone density, organ function, magical core development, neurological integrity, and flagged any residual dark magic. In healthy 14-month-old children, it produced a soft golden light that moved over the body from head to foot in about 30 seconds and then faded. Miriam had performed this spell several hundred times. She knew exactly what it looked like. She cast it. The light came up gold, as it always did, and then Harry screamed, not the way infants cry from discomfort or startle. He screamed the way someone screams when something hurts, a raw, full-throated sound that filled the small room and brought Miriam's hand snapping back as she instinctively cut the spell. Harry's back arched off the table, and the gold diagnostic light didn't fade. It flickered, fractured, and turned dark, a deep bruised color that ran along the lines of his arms and legs like something burning under his skin. What did you do? Petunia was on her feet, reaching for him. Don't touch him yet. Miriam's voice came out sharp, and she was already moving, already pulling up her wand again with a different incantation entirely, a deeper diagnostic, a reading charm she hadn't used since a particularly bad curse case in '78. "Harry, I need you to lie still." Harry was not lying still. He was gripping the edges of the table with both small fists, chest heaving, tears running down his face, not crying now, just the aftermath of that scream still moving through him, and the dark light was still there, still running up and down the length of every bone in his body like something tracing a map. Miriam cast the deep reading charm with a controlled, careful flick. The result came back immediately, and she stopped moving. She read it again. She looked at Harry, then at her wand, then back at the diagnostic result hanging in the air above him in soft, luminous script that she recognized but couldn't immediately process because the number attached to the findings was wrong. It was an impossible number. It was a number she had never seen in 19 years and would not have believed was physically possible in a human body. Dark curse residue detected. Classification, multiple. Distribution, skeletal, full coverage. Estimated instances, 398, 399,400. The number ticked to 400 and stopped. Miriam stood very still for a long moment with the sound of Harry's ragged breathing filling the room and Petunia's sharp voice somewhere behind her saying something she couldn't quite hear because there was a roaring in her ears that she realized, distantly, was her own shock. Then she moved. "Mrs. Dursley," she said, and her voice came out steady because she had 19 years of practice making her voice come out steady. "I need you to press that yellow button by the door, right now." What's wrong with him? What did your spell? He's not in danger. She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway because Petunia Dursley looked 2 seconds away from grabbing Harry and running, and that could not happen. "Press the button. It calls another healer. I need a second opinion." Petunia pressed the button. Miriam picked Harry up off the table carefully and held him. He was still trembling faintly, those green eyes wet, and he grabbed the front of her lime green robes with both fists. She let him. She stood there holding the boy whose bones were apparently carrying 400 dark curses and breathed very slowly and thought, "All right, think properly. 400 curses. Distributed across every bone in his skeleton. The diagnostic had lit up like a grid, every skeletal structure from his skull to his toe bones showing residual dark magic. Not a single bone untouched. And the curses weren't random. She'd seen enough curse damage to know random, and this wasn't it. There was a pattern in how they'd been laid, a structure, though she couldn't read the specifics yet. The deep diagnostic charm wasn't fine enough for that. She needed the advanced team. She needed a curse specialist. She needed someone from the Department of Mysteries, probably. And as that thought crossed her mind, she filed it away because before she called anyone in from outside this hospital, she needed to understand exactly what she was looking at. The door opened, and healer Randolph Walsh came in, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who'd been her colleague for 12 years, and was one of the 3 people in this hospital she genuinely trusted. He took one look at her face, and all the professionally pleasant readiness drained out of his expression. "Rand," she said quietly, "look at this diagnostic result and tell me what you see." She turned so he could see the luminous script still hanging in the air. He looked. He read the number. She watched his face go through the same stages hers had: reading, rereading, disbelief, a very controlled form of alarm. "That can't be right," he said. "Run your own," she said. "Use yours, don't repeat mine." He pulled out his wand. Harry, still in Miriam's arms, looked at Walsh the way he'd looked at her, that flat, measuring consideration, and then looked away, apparently having reached some conclusion. Walsh ran the diagnostic. 400 curses came back again. Walsh lowered his wand slowly. "Bloody hell," he said, which from Randolph Walsh, who swore infrequently and mildly, was equivalent to anyone else dropping to their knees. "Right," Miriam said. "What are they? Can you?" "Not with a surface scan. I need deep analysis. I need a full curse mapping." She looked at Harry. He had stopped trembling and was now looking around the room with that unnerving calm, as though he'd processed his own distress and moved past it while the adults were still catching up. He reacted to the diagnostic spell. It triggered pain. Whatever these curses are, they're not dormant. "They're not suppressing his core," Walsh said, reading the diagnostic more carefully. His magical core is," he stopped. "I know," Miriam said. "That's not normal for a 14-month-old. I know, Rand. That's not normal for a 40-year-old. I know." Walsh looked at her. "Who else have you told?" "Just you." She shifted Harry slightly in her arms. He had relaxed fully now, which was somewhat extraordinary given the events of the last 5 minutes, and was examining the buttons on her collar with apparent scholarly interest. "I want to run the full mapping before I do anything else. I want to know what we're working with before we start making reports." Walsh glanced at Petunia, who had pressed herself against the wall near the door, and was watching all of this with an expression that was cycling rapidly between horror and the very specific fury of a person who feels completely out of their depth and has decided anger is the more manageable response. "She should probably wait outside," he said quietly. "Mrs. Dursley," Miriam said, turning to her with that same controlled calm, "this is going to take some time. There's a private waiting area just down the hall, much quieter than the main floor. Could you wait there? I'll come and speak with you as soon as I have more information, and I'll bring you tea." "What is wrong with him?" Petunia's voice was tight and high. What does that number mean, 400? "It means there's magical residue on his bones from the night in Godric's Hollow," Miriam said, which was true as far as it went and left out the terrifying specifics. "We need more detailed analysis to understand exactly what it is. He's not in danger." She paused. "He's actually remarkably calm." All three of them looked at Harry. Harry had finished examining her buttons and had now turned his attention to Walsh, looking at him with those extraordinary green eyes in a way that Walsh later would describe as like being red. Petunia left. She went without much more argument, which told Miriam something about the woman, not cruelty, she thought, but a certain practical self-protection. Petunia Dursley had been brought into a world she feared and didn't understand and handed a baby who was part of it, and her response to being overwhelmed was to get very small and very controlled and look away. Miriam, who was a healer and not a social worker, filed this observation and moved on. The curse mapping took 3 hours. Walsh stayed. He canceled his afternoon appointments without explanation, which was the Randolph Walsh version of a dramatic gesture, and the two of them worked through the afternoon in the deep diagnostic room on the 5th floor, a room they usually used for long-term curse damage cases, while Harry sat in the middle of the specialized examination circle, and after the first 10 minutes of the mapping process had established that it didn't hurt him, became progressively more interested in the colored light the instruments were producing. He kept reaching for it. Miriam kept gently redirecting his hands. He would wait, watch her face to determine if she'd looked away, and reach for the light again. By the second hour, she stopped redirecting him and let him do it, partly because she was deep in the curse mapping data and partly because she'd noticed something. When Harry touched the diagnostic light, it changed color in ways that the instruments recorded but that she couldn't yet explain. Like he was interacting with the diagnostic itself, like something in him was responding. The mapping filled 12 scrolls of parchment by the time it was done. Miriam sat at the analysis desk and read through them while Walsh stood over her shoulder, occasionally pointing at specific lines, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The curses were ancient. That was the first thing that struck her. These weren't modern dark curse constructs, the kind Death Eaters deployed. Several of them she didn't recognize at all, which for a healer of her experience was significant. The diagnostic charm had been forced to reach back through its reference library to classify some of them, flagging 3 as pre-ministry and 1 as origin unknown. They were layered. That was the second thing. Deliberately, architecturally layered curse upon curse upon curse in a sequence that had clear intentionality. This wasn't the result of being hit with multiple spells. This was constructed, placed, arranged in a specific order across specific bones, and the arrangement had a geometry to it, a symmetry that her analytical mind kept trying to organize into a recognizable shape. The third thing was the one that made her set down the parchment and sit quietly for almost a full minute before she could speak. None of the 400 curses had caused damage. She could find no skeletal damage, no evidence of magical burn, no degradation of bone integrity. The curses were sitting inside him, inside the actual cellular structure of his bones, intact, alive, active at a very low level, and not harming him. "Rand," she said finally, "what do you do with 400 active dark curses inside a body that isn't being damaged by them?" Walsh sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "You don't," he said. "That's not Miriam, that shouldn't be possible. A single sustained dark curse will cause tissue damage. 24 will start causing systemic effects. 400 should be lethal, at minimum catastrophic." She tapped the parchment. And yet, Walsh agreed, looking at Harry, who had found one of the diagnostic instrument's rubber protective covers and was systematically attempting to remove it. "His core," Walsh said again, the thing they'd both been quietly circling. "Run me through that reading again." She flipped to the relevant scroll. "Magical core density, current reading at 14 months old, off-chart high." The instrument gave an estimated value, but flagged it as potentially inaccurate, because it's calibrated for standard distribution, and he's outside the standard distribution. For context, the highest core density I've ever recorded in a first-year diagnostic was a 7-year-old with 3 generations of pure blood magical concentration. She tested at level 9. "And Harry," Miriam paused, "the instrument defaulted to level 14. Walsh was quiet for a moment. "The scale only goes to 15. I know, he's 14 months old. I know, Rand, they sat with this." "The curses fed it," Walsh said slowly, working it out aloud in the methodical way that made him a good healer. "Whatever this is, this arrangement, this architecture, it's been using his body to process dark magic. Like a conversion. The curses are active, but they're not attacking his body there." "Being absorbed," Miriam said. The word came out certain before she'd fully thought it through, but it felt right in a way that the data supported. Or transformed. They were meant to do something else, presumably killing curse business, presumably that night, and instead they hit a surviving body and they're being metabolized. She picked up the parchment and looked at it again. "Into this. That would explain his core readings. That would explain everything." She stood up and walked to where Harry was sitting. He looked up at her, rubber protective cover in both hands. "Who did this?" she said, not to him, just sort of aloud. "Who put 400 dark curses inside a baby's bones, and why?" Harry looked at her with those green eyes and offered her the rubber cover. She took it. "Thank you," she said automatically. He smiled at her. It was the first time he'd smiled since they'd walked in, and it was a real one, sudden, bright, transforming his whole face, and Miriam felt something shift in her chest that was unprofessional and entirely human, and she filed it alongside the Petunia observation and moved on. The call came at 4:30. She was writing up the initial findings report carefully, choosing her language with the precision of someone disarming something explosive, when the communication mirror on the wall flickered, and the face of Marcus Flint, chief administrator of St. Mungo's, appeared. He was a thin, nervous man who had been chief administrator for 3 years and had managed it by avoiding anything complicated. "Healer Thorne," he said, "I need to see you in my office. Now, please." She looked at the mirror and then at Walsh, who had carefully not moved or spoken. "I'm in the middle of a case analysis," she said. "It's regarding that case," Flint said, and something in his voice told her everything she needed to know. "Please come up." She set down her quill and stood and straightened her robes and went. Flint's office was on the 7th floor, which was administrative territory, which smelled differently from the rest of the hospital, less antiseptic, more parchment and wood polish, the scent of institutional authority. He was waiting for her behind his desk, and he wasn't alone. There were 2 men she didn't recognize, both in dark ministry robes without identifying insignia, and a third figure she recognized immediately. Augustus Fairweather, senior undersecretary to the Minister of Magic, whose name she knew from the papers and whose presence in this hospital was about as welcome to her as a flobberworm in a surgical kit. "Healer Thorne," Fairweather said. He had the smooth, practiced manner of a man who spent his life managing situations. Silver-haired, well-dressed, affable in a way that was entirely calculated. "Please sit down." She sat down. She looked at the 2 men in dark robes and then back at Fairweather. "I understand you've had quite an interesting day," he said. "The case notes are being prepared," she said. "I'll have them filed by end of business." "Yes, about that," Fairweather smiled. I'd like to discuss the filing process, specifically where certain elements of today's diagnostic findings will be filed. There it was. Miriam looked at him with the calm that she'd spent 19 years cultivating, the calm that came from having stood beside people in the worst moments of their lives and not flinching. "Where would you like them filed?" she said carefully. "The ministry maintains a separate archive for cases involving sensitive magical events," Fairweather said. "Given the extraordinary circumstances surrounding young Harry Potter's survival, it seems most appropriate that his medical records be secured through ministry channels. For his protection, of course." "Of course," Miriam said. "We'd like the diagnostic scrolls, all copies." "And your written report," he kept the smile, "tonight ideally, and the standard St. Mungo's record will be simplified, basic checkup, good health. Nothing unusual." He said it like he was telling her the weather. "We wouldn't want to cause public alarm over findings that may not be as significant as they initially appear." The two men in dark robes hadn't moved or spoken. They were positioned. She noticed this with the spatial awareness of someone who'd worked in high-pressure environments between her and the door. Miriam looked at Flint, who was examining his desk with intense focus. Then she looked at Fairweather. "I see," she said, "and Harry Potter's ongoing medical care, who manages that under this arrangement?" "The ministry will ensure he receives appropriate care through proper channels. He has 400 active dark curses in his bones," she said, and had the small satisfaction of watching the smooth certainty on Fairweather's face develop a hairline fracture. "That's not a filing issue. That's an ongoing medical situation requiring specialist follow-up. The ministry has no diagnostic healers cleared for this level of curse analysis," she said. "I checked the registry 2 years ago when we were building the curse damage unit. There are 7 healers in Britain qualified for advanced dark curse mapping. 3 of them work in this building." She paused. "Are you going to be arranging adequate medical supervision? Or are you going to be arranging for a 14-month-old child to walk around with 400 active ancient dark curses in his body, while the ministry decides what's politically convenient?" Fairweather's smile had gone. Underneath it, he looked like a man doing rapid calculations. "Healer Thorne," he said, and the affable tone was still there, but underneath it was something harder. "I want to make sure you understand the sensitivity of this situation. The stability of the wizarding world right now is—" "I understand," she said. "I also understand my obligations under the St. Mungo's healer's oath, which includes patient welfare and accurate record-keeping, and which supersedes ministry administrative preferences." She stood up. "I'll prepare the case report. I'll send a copy to the ministry archive as a courtesy, as is standard for all ministry-referred cases. And I'll retain my own clinical copy as is my legal right under the Healer's Code, which has been standing since 1703. She looked at Fairweather, then at the 2 men by the door, then at the door itself. "Excuse me." She walked to the door. The 2 men looked at Fairweather. Fairweather looked at her back. And then, because she had called his bluff accurately, he couldn't physically stop her here, not in this hospital, not without making a scene that would be far more damaging than letting her walk. He said nothing, and she opened the door and went through it. Her hands were steady on the door handle. She was very proud of that. She went back to her office and stood in it for a full 2 minutes doing absolutely nothing. Then she pulled out a piece of parchment, not from the hospital supply, her own, from the personal stationery in her desk drawer, and wrote a letter. Careful, precise, factual. The diagnostic findings, the ministry response, her assessment of Harry's ongoing medical needs. She sealed it, addressed it, and held it in both hands for a moment. She was writing to Albus Dumbledore, because she didn't have better options and she knew it, and because the letter Flint had let slip earlier. The ministry had been alerted to Harry's appointment through Dumbledore's office. The referral had come from there, meant that Dumbledore knew something, and Dumbledore knowing something and doing nothing with it was a specific kind of danger she wanted to preempt. She wrote a second letter and addressed it to herself, care of her sister's address in Edinburgh. She put the full diagnostic scrolls inside, spelled them small, and slipped them into the envelope. She sent both letters with 2 different hospital owls, which she dispatched from the 7th floor window, watching them climb against the gray November sky until they were too small to see. Then she went back to the consultation room. Harry was asleep on the examination table. Walsh had wrapped him in his blanket and was sitting in the corner chair doing paperwork with the slightly elaborate casualness of someone who wanted to give the impression of normalcy. Petunia was in the chair beside the table, not touching Harry but close, and she looked up when Miriam came in with an expression that was trying to be stern and wasn't quite managing it. "Can I take him home?" she said. "Yes," Miriam said. "Soon." She sat down. "I want to explain what we found, Mrs. Dursley. I want to explain it properly to you, because you're the person who will be with him and you should understand what to watch for. You're going to tell me there's something wrong with him. I'm going to tell you there's something in him," Miriam said carefully, "that we don't fully understand yet. It doesn't appear to be harming him. In some ways it may be the opposite." She paused, choosing her words. "On the night in Godric's Hollow, when his parents died, something magical happened when the curse struck him. Something that's never happened before, and some of that something is still happening inside him, slowly, quietly." Petunia was looking at her with those sharp, frightened eyes. Will it hurt him? Miriam thought about the diagnostic scrolls. The impossibly high magical core reading. The 400 curses sitting in his bones like sleeping things. The way he'd reached for the light and the light had changed color. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think it will depend enormously on what happens to him in the years ahead, what he experiences, how he grows, who he has around him." Petunia looked at her nephew. He was asleep with his fist curled under his chin, dark lashes on his cheek, the lightning bolt scar showing above the edge of the blanket. "He's just a baby," she said. Not the way she'd said things before, the tight, defensive clipping, but something quieter. Something that sounded very briefly like it hurt. "Yes," Miriam said, "he is." They sat in silence for a moment. In the corridor outside, the hospital moved on around them. Footsteps, voices, the distant sound of someone being wheeled on a stretcher. And the three of them occupied this small room with its examination table and its two bright lights. And outside the window the November dark had fully arrived. And somewhere in the city an owl was flying with a letter that would change things. Miriam reached out and gently adjusted Harry's blanket. He didn't wake. His magical core was doing something quiet and extraordinary inside his tiny body. 400 ancient curses were doing something she didn't have a framework for yet, and he slept through it the way he appeared to process everything, with a calm that was entirely his own, unasked for and unlearned, simply there. She had been a healer for 19 years. She had never been afraid of knowledge. She realized, sitting in this room with this sleeping child, a little afraid now. Not of Harry, never of Harry. Afraid of everyone who was going to want something from him, once they understood what she understood. She resolved then, quietly and entirely privately, in the way that large decisions sometimes made themselves without fanfare. She was going to understand this fully before she let anyone else touch it. She was going to understand what had been done to this boy and why and what it meant. And she was going to do it while the ministry was busy managing the paperwork and congratulating themselves on controlling the narrative. She had 12 copies of those diagnostic scrolls, and she had the best curse-mapping mind in Britain, and she had a deeply inconvenient sense of professional ethics. It would have to be enough. Harry slept on, his bones full of ancient dark architecture and his small heart beating steadily. And outside the hospital window London went about its business in the dark and knew nothing about any of it. Chapter 2. What Azkaban forgot. Azkaban was not a place that allowed you to keep track of time. That was intentional. Sirius Black had decided somewhere in the first few weeks, though weeks was already a guess, already a construct he was building out of stubborn refusal rather than any actual evidence. The Dementors didn't keep schedules. Light didn't reach the cells in any meaningful way, just a gray diffusion that was the same at noon as it was at midnight. Meals arrived irregularly. Seasons were theoretical. Time was something they took from you as systematically as warmth and hope, and the sound of your own laughter. Sirius had been here for 2 weeks, or 3, possibly 4. He knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with dates or calendars that James and Lily were dead. He knew because he'd been there. He'd stood in the wreckage of their house in Godric's Hollow and found them, and the memory was so large and so terrible that the Dementors kept pulling at it, kept reaching through his skull for that specific moment, the specific texture of it, the way the air had smelled, and every time they pulled he felt it happen again and couldn't stop it. He sat in his cell and focused on breathing. That was the technique. Breathing and the small specific physical sensations he could still access. The cold stone under his hands, the weight of his own body, the sound his own lungs made working. He was still here, he was still Sirius Black. He was still, despite every effort being made to dissolve him, a person. Harry was alive. He held on to that too. He'd seen the first prophet, a guard had dropped one in the corridor 2 cells down, and the other prisoner had pushed it through to him, and he'd read it 3 times in the gray light before it disintegrated. Harry was alive. The killing curse had somehow failed. Boy who lived, the prophet had called him, in letters large enough to be read through tears and Dementor-induced misery, and Sirius had pressed his back against the cold wall and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He should have Harry. He was supposed to have Harry. That had been the plan, the agreement, the thing James had said to him in the kitchen of the Potter's house 3 months before everything ended. If anything happens, Padfoot, you're his. That's already decided. And Sirius had said nothing's going to happen, and James had looked at him with those bright, certain eyes and said, but if it does. He was in Azkaban instead. No trial, no hearing. He'd been taken from Godric's Hollow still in a daze of grief, still making sounds he wasn't fully in control of, and processed with the efficiency of a ministry that needed someone to blame quickly and didn't want the complications of due process slowing them down. He was Peter's secret keeper. Peter had died. It was tidy. It was wrong. It was catastrophically, irretrievably wrong in a way that Sirius couldn't make anyone hear from inside a cell in the North Sea, but it was tidy. He thought about Peter a lot. The thoughts were not calm. He thought about Harry more. He thought about Miriam Thorne on the 43rd day. The letter arrived in the way that letters arrived in Azkaban, illegally, secretly, through a network of sympathies that the ministry knew existed and couldn't quite eradicate. There were guards who were humane. There were owls that were very clever. There were people outside who had not given up on the people inside. The owl was a small, sandy brown thing that came through the narrow, high window at what his body told him was very late at night. It dropped a tightly rolled piece of parchment the size of his thumb, spelled to look like a bit of rubbish, and was gone before he'd fully processed it was there. He unrolled the parchment, waited for his eyes to adjust, read it twice. Then he sat on the floor of his cell, the parchment in both hands, and felt something he hadn't felt since the night in Godric's Hollow, the specific electric quality of rage that burns clean rather than consuming, not grief, not despair, fury. The kind that had a direction. The letter was from a name he didn't recognize. M. Thorne sent. Mungo's, and it was short and careful and said, between its factual lines, everything it needed to say. Harry had been brought in for a checkup. Harry's diagnostic results had been extraordinary. The ministry had attempted to suppress the findings. Thorne had retained her own copies. Harry had 400 dark curses in his bones and a magical core that was off the charts, and he was living with a muggle aunt on Privet Drive, and the ministry wanted no one asking questions, and Albus Dumbledore had so far been quiet. I am writing to you, the letter said at the end, in slightly less careful handwriting, as though this paragraph had been added after the main text, because your name is in his file as next of kin. I do not know your circumstances. I understand there are complications, but someone who loves him should know what I know, and I could not find another name. Sirius read someone who loves him, and the fury went from electric to absolute. He stood up. He walked to the door of his cell. He pressed both hands against the cold iron and looked out through the bars at the corridor, gray stone, gray light, the distant shuffling presence of a Dementor at the far end, and he thought, with a clarity that would have frightened him if he'd been capable of being frightened right now, about what came next. He had been in Azkaban for 43 days. He was going to leave now. The transformation took 3 minutes. He'd never tested how small he could make himself as Padfoot. He'd never had reason to. The bars of the cell door were 8 inches apart, designed for a human body, not a large dog, but a very thin large dog, a starving large dog who'd lost what felt like 30 pounds in 6 weeks of Azkaban food, was perhaps a different calculation. He pressed his muzzle through first, ears flat, then one shoulder, then the terrible grinding moment where his ribcage was either going through or it wasn't, and it went through, and the rest of him followed in a graceless controlled fall onto the corridor floor. He lay still for 30 seconds. The Dementor at the far end hadn't moved. Padfoot's brain worked differently from Sirius's brain, simpler, faster, more sensory, and in this shape the Dementor's effect was diminished, not gone. He could still feel the cold of it, still feel the gray pull at the edges of his thoughts. But a dog's brain had fewer complex memories to feast on or fewer ways to access them, and he could move. He moved. The security logic of Azkaban was built around the assumption that human prisoners couldn't get through the bars. Nobody had ever felt the need to account for an animagus in the cell registry, not this animagus anyway, whose status was unregistered and therefore unknown. He had the Registration Commission to thank for that. Or rather, 15-year-old James Potter had, the boy who'd talked him into keeping it secret because where's the fun in telling them, Padfoot? He found a vent that led to the outer levels. He found a gap in the seaward wall where the stone had been slowly losing a battle with the North Sea for about 2 centuries. He swam 3 miles in water that was trying its level best to kill him with cold, and washed up on a rocky spit of coastline that was technically part of Scotland, and lay there with his chest heaving, and the salt water draining off his fur, while the sky above him did the extraordinary and almost forgotten thing of being open. He lay there for a while just breathing open sky. Then he got up, shook himself, pointed his nose south and ran. It took him 6 days to reach London, moving at night, eating what he could catch, avoiding roads and people and anything that looked like a magical signature. He was a ghost moving through the countryside, lean and silent, and he let himself be nothing but the dog for most of it because the dog didn't have to think about James or Lily, or the fact that Peter Pettigrew, who he had trusted with his life and called his brother, had sold them all. The dog didn't have to think about any of that. The dog just ran. He found a safe house on the 7th day, not his own. Those would be watched, but one of the old order locations, a flat above a bookshop in Camden that had been used for mail drops and meetings and the occasional safekeeping of something important. He'd memorized 6 of these addresses, the way you memorize things you hope you'll never need. The flat was dusty and cold, but the wards were intact, and there was a change of clothes someone had left in the back of a cupboard, and there was a fireplace. He built a fire and sat in front of it and let himself be human again, which hurt in all the ways it always hurt after extended time in the dog shape. The sudden weight of complex thought, the rush of memory, the grief slamming back in like water through a broken hull. He sat with it until it wasn't actively drowning him. This took a while. Then he opened the fireplace and called in a favor. Miriam Thorne was eating toast over her kitchen sink at 7 in the morning when the fireplace turned green, and a face appeared in it that she did not recognize, which was alarming enough. But the face was also gaunt, hollow-eyed, and several weeks overdue for a shave, and it looked at her with the specific intensity of someone who had been surviving on pure will for an extended period. She put the toast down slowly and kept her wand in her right hand where she could reach it. "Healer Thorne," the face said. The voice was rough, but the diction was educated, crisp beneath the exhaustion. "My name is Sirius Black. I got your letter." Miriam said nothing for a moment. She processed several things simultaneously. Sirius Black. Name she knew, name that had been in Harry's file, name that was supposed to be in Azkaban. The fireplace was secure. She warded it herself every night. The face was watching her with something that she thought, if she was being accurate, was hope, with the very thinnest coating of composure over the top of it. "You're supposed to be in Azkaban," she said. "Yes," he said, "I left." "You left." The bars were wider than the designer's thought, a brief, exhausted ghost of something that might once have been a grin. "I read your letter, Healer Thorne. I need you to tell me what's wrong with Harry." "I don't know that I should be having this conversation," she said, because it was true, and because the professional part of her brain was doing its job even while the rest of her was rapidly assessing. "You're a wanted, I didn't kill anyone," he said, and the words came out flat and quiet and certain in a way that gave her pause, not defensive, not desperate. Just a man stating a fact he was tired of the universe ignoring. I was Peter Pettigrew's secret keeper. Peter sold the Potters. Peter is alive. I was never given a trial. He paused. I understand if you don't believe me. But that's why I'm not in Azkaban, and this is why I'm in your fireplace. I am Harry Potter's godfather. I am his legal next of kin. And you wrote to me saying there are 400 dark curses in his bones and nobody who loves him should be left uninformed. So here I am. Inform me. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Fairweather's smooth voice and the two men by the door, and the way the ministry had moved to suppress Harry's file within hours of her findings. She thought about what it meant that Sirius Black, gaunt and exhausted, had chosen Harry as the thing to come back for. Sit down, she said. This will take some time. They talked for 2 hours. She told him everything. The diagnostic results, the curse mapping, the architectural layering, the impossibly high magical core. She told him about Fairweather and the suppression attempt. She told him what she'd been doing in the months since, the letters to academic contacts, the obscure curse history texts she'd been quietly acquiring, the slow and painstaking process of trying to understand what the 400 curses were for. He listened. All of it. The kind of listening that's entirely still, not the restless fidgeting of someone waiting for their turn to speak. She could see him processing things, filing them, connecting them to things he already knew. And he clearly did know things she didn't, because once or twice his expression shifted in a way that suggested her information was falling into a framework he'd already been building. The night it happened, he said finally, the night of Godric's Hollow, what do you know about the actual sequence of events? What's been published? Forget what's been published. His jaw tightened briefly. I was there 3 hours after I saw the house. I know what the curse damage looked like on the structure. He stopped. Something passed across his face, and he smoothed it back deliberately. The killing curse leaves a specific signature. Stone, wood, organic material, it chars in a specific way, a particular dark discoloration. In the room where Harry was, the curse signature was wrong. The discoloration pattern was on the caster's side of the room. Miriam went still. As if, she said slowly, the curse reversed. As if it reversed, yes. He leaned forward slightly. And before it reversed, there was, I don't know how to explain this precisely. Lily studied curse reflection theory. She was brilliant at it, genuinely. She had ideas that went well beyond what the Department of Mysteries was officially working on. He said this without bitterness, just as established fact. She'd been working on something for months before the end. She never told me the specifics because she said she didn't want me to worry. He smiled very briefly, something small and painful. I should have worried. You think she did something, that night, that created the condition that allowed the curse to reverse. I think she did something that created the condition that used Harry as the mechanism for the reversal. And I think whatever she built, he stopped, working through it, left something behind inside him. He looked at Miriam. 400 curses worth of something. That's not how counter-curses work, Miriam said. You can't build a curse reflection structure inside a living person's bones. No, Sirius agreed. You can't, he held her gaze, which means she didn't build a counter-curse. Miriam set down her tea and looked at the cooling liquid in the cup and thought very hard. She built something else, she said. She built something else, Sirius confirmed. They sat with this. Do you know what? She said. No, not specifically. He leaned back. I know Lily, I know the way she thought. She would have looked at an impossible situation and asked not how do I survive this, but how do I make sure Harry does. She wouldn't have tried to deflect. She would have tried to use whatever was coming. He paused. She was extraordinary, Healer Thorne. Not in the way the papers say she was extraordinary, in ways that were much harder to explain. Miriam nodded. She had no framework for this, for the grief of it, for the specific brightness of someone who'd loved Lily Potter talking about what she'd been capable of. She left it alone. Where's Harry now? He said. The question was quiet, controlled, but under the control was something enormous, Privet Drive. Little winging, Surrey, she hesitated. The ministry has the address. Dumbledore has the address. Mrs. Dursley seems to be managing. Something moved across Sirius's face. Petunia is managing, the ghost of sharpness. Lily's sister, who hadn't spoken to Lily in 3 years and thought all of this, he gestured vaguely, meaning magic, the entire world was an abomination. She brought him in, she came. She came because she was told to, that's different. He was quiet for a moment. He should be with me. You're currently a fugitive from Azkaban. I know, his voice didn't waver. I'm working on that. Are you? She studied him. How? Carefully. His eyes met hers. Is there anything in those diagnostic scrolls that indicates Harry is in physical danger, immediate danger? She considered this honestly. Not immediate. The curses are stable at current developmental stage. What concerns me more is long-term. What happens as his magical core develops, as the curse architecture becomes more active? I don't have a framework for what that process will look like. Nobody does because nothing like this has ever happened. She paused. He needs monitoring, regular diagnostic work. He needs someone who understands his specific situation watching his development. The ministry's plan, as far as I can tell, is to put him on a shelf and pray the situation stays quiet. Sirius made a short, quiet sound. Standard ministry policy for everything they find inconvenient. He straightened. I need copies of those scrolls. I already have a copy secured, a copy I can access. Can study. He met her eyes. I know curse theory. James and I spent 2 years of our lives learning how to break curses because we had a friend who needed them broken. The word friend carried something complicated in it, something that she recognized as grief wrapped around betrayal. I am not going to be much use to Harry in a general way, until I can get myself out of this specific legal situation. But I can work on understanding what's inside him, if you'll let me. Miriam looked at him. Gaunt, exhausted, escaped from Azkaban, wearing someone else's clothes that were slightly too large, and talking about curse theory with his chin up and those gray eyes absolutely clear. You get a letter to me every week, she said. One of your own telling me where you are, not exact location. I don't want exact location, just alive and mobile. If I don't get a letter, I stop sending information and I tell someone you reached out, which I'll do with significant regret. She held up a hand before he could speak. It's not about trusting you. I do, provisionally. It's about Harry. If something happens to you, I need to know there are no loose ends that lead back to him. Sirius looked at her steadily for a moment. All right, he said. And when you say you're working on the legal situation, she said. What does that actually mean? It means Peter Pettigrew is alive, he said again, with the same flat, exhausted certainty, and eventually he's going to surface. He's been in hiding 12 years of his life in one form or another. He can't do it forever. His jaw set. And when he does, I'm going to be there. And if that takes years, then I'll wait. He said it like it cost nothing. Like waiting was a thing he'd already decided the price of and found it acceptable. I waited in Azkaban for 6 weeks before I had a reason to leave. I can wait somewhere that doesn't have dementors. 3 days after that conversation, Miriam was sitting in her office at St. Mungo's going through the 4th volume of a very old Mesopotamian curse compilation text, acquired at significant personal expense from an antiquarian in Edinburgh who'd looked at her like she was slightly unhinged for wanting it when she found it. She almost missed it. The text was dense, written in a mixture of archaic Latin and pre-Aramaic magical notation, and the translation was her own rough work-through with a translation dictionary and 4 years of academic curse studies from before she'd gone into clinical practice. She'd been going through it systematically for 2 weeks. It was on page 312, embedded in a chapter about ritual bone inscription curses used in pre-Merlin blood magic, and it was almost nothing. A footnote, really. A half-paragraph that a compiler had added from an even older source text that no longer existed. But the description in the footnote matched the mapping she'd done on Harry's bones with a specificity that made her set down the translation dictionary very slowly and read it 3 more times. The resonance architecture, the footnote called it. It had been considered theoretical for centuries magical construction that used living bone as a medium for storing, processing, and ultimately converting dark magical energy. The ancient practitioners who'd supposedly developed it hadn't built it to be activated from outside. The theory was that it had to be built in response to an existing dark magical event. had to be grown, like a crystal structure finding its own geometry in a supersaturated solution. Had to be initiated by sacrifice. Miriam sat with this for a long time. Lily Potter had not just cast a counter curse and died. She had built something inside her son's bones, using the death curse as raw material, and her own death as the mechanism of initiation. A structure for converting dark magical energy, for using it, for making it into something else. She thought about Harry on the examination table, reaching for the diagnostic light with both hands, completely unafraid. She thought about that magical core reading. 14 on a scale of 15, at 14 months old, in a child who was being bathed in 400 active dark curse conversions every minute of every day, like a body-building muscle under the constant weight of enormous pressure. She pressed both palms flat on the desk and thought, "Lily Potter, what did you make? And underneath that, did you know what you were making? And underneath that, does Dumbledore know?" She picked up her quill. Dumbledore's reply came in 4 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and which told her he'd been waiting for someone to ask. The letter was long, thoughtful, and exquisitely careful in the way that letters from very intelligent people could be careful, saying a great deal and committing to very little. He knew. Of course he knew. Or knew some of it. His letter danced around the curse mapping findings, not confirming her specifics but not contradicting them either, acknowledging unusual magical circumstances in language that suggested he was working from his own data rather than hers. What the letter said explicitly was this: Harry was where he needed to be, in the care of Lily's blood relative, which provided a protection that Dumbledore had been at significant pains to arrange and could not be easily replicated elsewhere. What was inside Harry was extraordinary but not immediately dangerous. The most important thing, Dumbledore wrote, with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being believed, was patience, time. Allowing Harry to grow without interference from parties who might seek to use what he carried. The wizarding world is not stable enough yet, Dumbledore wrote, to survive the knowledge of what Harry Potter is. I say this not to diminish his importance, but to protect it. The most dangerous thing we could do for this child is to make him legible to those who would weaponize that understanding. It was a good argument. Miriam read it twice and recognized its intelligence and its genuine care and the way it was still, underneath all of that, a man deciding on behalf of a child what that child should be allowed to become. She wrote back, "I hear you. I disagree about the timescale. I want quarterly diagnostics." Dumbledore replied, "In 2 days, monthly reports. I'll arrange access." She replied, "Quarterly diagnostics in person. Monthly written status checks from whoever is with him. I'm the lead healer on this case." "That's not a request." 4 days silence, then agreed. She folded his letter and put it in the file beside the diagnostic scrolls and the Mesopotamian footnote, and the growing stack of notes she was building on resonance architecture theory. And she sat in her office with the winter light coming through the window and thought about Harry on Privet Drive, surrounded by people who were afraid of him in various ways and for various reasons. And this thing growing inside his bones that had been built out of love and dark magic and sacrifice, and was slowly, steadily, making him into something nobody had a name for yet. She was going to keep watching. She was going to keep records. She was not going to let the Ministry bury it or Dumbledore manage it into something that served his purposes rather than Harry's. She was going to be there when it mattered. The November light shifted across her desk, and a small sandy brown owl tapped at the window. She opened it and untied the letter from its leg. Sirius Black's handwriting, brief, exact, alive and mobile, working, found something in the Malfoy family curse records that you should see. She felt unexpectedly something that resembled relief. She wrote back. The owl waited with professional patience while she finished, and then it was gone into the gray London sky, carrying words between two people who had decided, separately and together, that this particular child was not going to be left to whatever the world had planned for him. Downstairs in the hospital, a curse-damaged ward was quietly full of the war's aftermath, and the city moved on outside, and somewhere in Surrey in a house on a perfectly ordinary street, a 14-month-old boy with his mother's eyes and 400 impossible things inside him was doing whatever babies did in the specific determined way that was, already, entirely his own. Chapter 3. The boy on Privet Drive. 3 years was long enough for Privet Drive to forget it had ever been interesting. The neighbors had moved on from the whispers about the Dursleys' peculiar nephew, the one who'd arrived so dramatically, left on a doorstep in the dead of November like something out of a Victorian novel, and had filed Harry Potter away in the same mental drawer as other neighborhood curiosities. The Hendersons' ugly garden gnomes, the persistent smell of cabbage from number 9. He was simply there, the way furniture was simply there. A small, dark-haired boy with extraordinary eyes and a scar on his forehead that his aunt kept trying to cover with his fringe. Harry was 4 years old, and he was having a conversation with the garden, not with it precisely. He wasn't speaking to the roses. He was crouched at the edge of Petunia's flower bed with his hands pressed flat in the soil and his forehead creased in the particular concentration of a child doing something they haven't quite figured out the mechanics of yet, and the flowers were responding. Slightly. The way a compass responds to a magnet, no dramatic movement, just a persistent, unmistakable lean. He noticed Sirius watching from the kitchen window and looked up. "They do that," he said, by way of explanation. "I see that," Sirius said from the back door. "Does it happen with all plants?" Harry considered this with the thoroughness he applied to most questions, which was more thoroughness than most 4-year-olds managed. "The ones Aunt Petunia likes don't. The ones in the back that she doesn't water do." He looked back at the leaning roses. "I think they're bored." Sirius sat down on the back step. He'd been here 6 weeks, not in the house. The house was Petunia's, and there were limits to how much that particular arrangement could be pushed. But in the rented flat 2 streets over that he was technically renting as one David Lennox, history teacher, between terms. He was not a history teacher. He was a recently escaped Azkaban prisoner with forged Muggle documentation and a growing file of curse theory research and a godson who he saw every day and was still in the process of fully understanding. The legal situation was unresolved. It had been unresolved for 3 years, and he had stopped letting that be the thing he focused on, because focusing on the unresolvable was a good way to go slowly mad, and Azkaban had already taken a significant run at his sanity. He had a better lawyer now. Augusta Longbottom had arranged it, bless her formidable and uncompromising heart, and the case was moving with the speed that ministry legal processes moved, which was the speed of continental drift, but it was moving. In the meantime, Harry. "Come here," Sirius said. Harry extracted himself from the flower bed. He was wearing Dudley's old clothes, which were approximately twice his size, a thing that Sirius found privately infuriating and was working on changing, and came over to sit beside him on the step. He smelled like dirt, and the particular outdoor smell of small children who have been outside all afternoon. "Miriam's coming tomorrow," Sirius told him. Harry looked up. His face opened slightly, not dramatically. Harry didn't do dramatic emotional displays, but a small perceptible shift, the way a door moves when the pressure behind it changes. He liked Miriam. He'd known her his whole remembered life, quarterly visits, a constant presence in the particular way that someone reliable becomes part of the architecture of your world. "Checkup," he said. "Checkup," Sirius confirmed. "You remember what that means. Lie still and don't touch the lights," he paused, "even though they change when I do, even though." Harry looked at his hands. They were dirty from the garden, small and brown and entirely ordinary looking. He turned them over once, examining them with the same expression he'd turned on the flowers. "Sirius," he said, "why do the lights change when I touch them?" This was the conversation Sirius had been expecting and preparing for and still didn't entirely know how to have. Harry was 4. He was also, by any reasonable assessment, considerably more cognitively operational than most 4-year-olds, which the resonance architecture apparently did something to. Miriam's working theory was that the constant conversion of magical energy was affecting neural development, which she said with the careful tone she used for things she was confident about but hadn't fully proven yet. "Because you have something inside you," Sirius said, going with direct, which had always been his approach with Harry and which Harry consistently responded to better than any softened version of anything. "Something that changes the way magic works around you. It's been there since you were a baby." Harry absorbed this. "What is it?" We don't entirely know yet. Miriam's working on it. I'm working on it. He looked at the boy beside him. What it does, as far as we can tell, is take dark magic and turn it into something else. Something that isn't dark. He paused. Your mum put it there. Harry was quiet for a moment. He asked about Lily and James with a matter-of-fact directness that sometimes caught Sirius off guard. Not sad, exactly, because you couldn't be sad about people you had no memory of, but genuinely curious, the way he was curious about everything. She could do that, put things inside people. She was extraordinary, Sirius said, the most brilliant curse specialist I ever knew. And I knew a few. Harry looked at his hands again. Does it hurt? No, Sirius said immediately. Then, because he was trying to be honest, not anymore. When you were very small it did briefly, the first diagnostic. But not now. Not now, Harry nodded slowly. This was the thing about him. He processed difficult information and filed it and moved forward. Not because he was suppressing anything, but because he had, apparently, been born with the emotional architecture of someone who found the present more interesting than the frightening. Sirius sometimes looked at him and thought, this is what Lily would have made if she'd sat down and deliberately built a person. Can I touch the lights tomorrow? Harry said. Sirius laughed, which was still sometimes a surprise that he still could, that it still came easily with this small person beside him. Ask Miriam. Miriam arrived at 9 in the morning, which was her standard time, and she came through the back gate with her bag over her shoulder, and her reading glasses pushed up on her head in a way that meant she'd been reading on the walk from wherever she'd apparated to, which Sirius had long since identified as her version of distracted. She stopped when she saw the flowers. They were leaning, all of them, the whole back flower bed and the potted plants along the fence, and the single unhappy rose that Petunia had planted beside the garden shed and mostly ignored. All of it tilted gently toward the back step where Harry was sitting eating toast. Harry, Miriam said carefully, how long has this been happening? Harry looked at the flowers and then at her. Since Tuesday, before or after we discussed the diagnostic light, he considered. Same day. Miriam put her bag down on the garden table and sat across from it and opened it and started pulling out instruments with the focused efficiency that meant she was recalibrating her expectations. Sirius, watching from the doorway with a second cup of tea, recognized the expression. It was the one she got when Harry's development had once again outpaced her most recent working model. It happened roughly every 3 months. He's been doing something with the plants, Sirius said. I see that. She looked at Harry. Do you know you're doing it? Mostly, Harry said. What does it feel like? He put down his toast and thought about this with genuine attention, the way he always thought about her questions, as though her questions deserved real answers rather than quick ones. Like when you hold a door open, he said finally. You're not pulling it or pushing it, just holding the space. Miriam wrote this down. Sirius watched her write it and knew she was going to pull apart that metaphor for 2 weeks trying to find the physical mechanics of what he just described. Come inside, she said. Let's have a look at you. The diagnostic room was the second bedroom of Sirius's flat, which he'd spent 2 weeks preparing when this arrangement was new. The examination circle chalked on the floorboards and sealed with a permanent spell. The instruments arranged on the shelf in the order Miriam preferred. The modified magical shielding on the walls so the neighbors didn't pick up anything from the diagnostic scans. It looked, Sirius had always thought, aggressively clinical for a room that was otherwise just a bedroom above a Surrey off-license. But Miriam had approved it, and Harry had long since made his peace with it. Harry climbed onto the examination table, a transfigured camp bed, essentially, modified for the purpose, and lay down and put his arms straight at his sides in the practiced, cooperative posture of a child who had been doing this since before he could properly remember. Same as usual, Miriam said, wand coming up. Tell me if anything feels different. It won't hurt, Harry said, not a question. It won't hurt, she confirmed. The diagnostic light came up gold and moved over him, and nothing screamed and nothing fractured. That had been true since he was 18 months old. Whatever the initial diagnostic had triggered, whatever pain the first scan had caused, it hadn't repeated. The curse architecture inside him had evidently completed some initial phase of establishment and settled, and was now apparently stable enough to coexist with standard diagnostic magic without protest. What the diagnostic showed had not stabilized. Every scan was different. Every scan was more. Miriam watched the numbers come up, and her face did what it always did, the professional stillness over the thing underneath that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite awe. Sirius had learned to read it. Core density, he said from the doorway. I'm going to need to recalibrate the instruments again, she said, which was answer enough. How far off the scale? This instrument goes to 15. She paused. I need a different instrument. She pulled a second one from her bag, this one older and heavier looking, with the patina of genuine age. She'd acquired it 6 months ago from a private collection in Prague. The Bessemer diagnostic extends to 25. I've never used it on a living patient before. She ran the second instrument. The result made her sit down on the stool beside the examination table. 19, she said, not to anyone specifically, just the word into the room. Harry looked at her. Is that bad? No, she said. It's just, she stopped. Started again. When we compare it to the standard magical population, Harry, most adult witches and wizards fall somewhere between level 4 and level 9. The strongest I've ever recorded in a healthy adult was level 11. She set the instrument down carefully. You're 4 years old and you're at level 19. Harry processed this. Will it keep going? Miriam and Sirius looked at each other over his head. We think so, Miriam said honestly. Yes. Good, Harry said, with a simple certainty that was so uncomplicated it briefly silenced both of them. The real work of the diagnostic was the curse mapping, which took most of the morning. Miriam sat cross-legged on the floor of the examination room with 12 scrolls of previous mapping data spread around her, and the new results building up on a fresh parchment, and Harry sitting across from her, nominally in the examination circle, but in practice doing exactly what she let him do during the long stretch of mapping analysis, which was ask questions. He was very good at questions. They were never the questions you expected. What were the curses for? He asked, which was more sophisticated than the questions she'd been anticipating, and she said so. What do you mean? Before Mum changed them. What were they for originally? He was looking at the mapping results with the tilt of focused attention he got around things he was trying to understand. Were they all the same kind? No. She shifted one of the scrolls so he could see the classification column. See these markers. These indicate different categories of dark magic. Some of them are what we'd call maleficent, designed to harm biological systems. Some are more structural, designed to bind or contain. A few are so old we don't have proper classification terms for them. Where did they come from? Good question. She tapped the oldest cluster on the mapping. Our best theory is that some of them were embedded in the killing curse itself, part of its composition. Others we think may have accumulated over generations. Your family line is very old, Harry. Some of these may have been there dormant for years, waiting for a sufficient energy event to activate them. Harry looked at the map of his own bones with the same expression he'd turned on the leaning flowers, curious. Proprietorial in a quiet way, this is mine and I'm interested in it. So Mum didn't put them there, he said. She just changed what they were doing. That's our current understanding, yes. Like she redirected the door. He picked up the metaphor from earlier and fitted it to the new context with the easy facility that made Miriam's brain light up every time she watched him do it. She was already holding it open. She just changed where it went. Miriam put down her quill. She looked at this 4-year-old boy with dirt still under his fingernails from the garden. Yes, she said slowly. That is actually a very accurate description of what we think she did. Harry nodded. He accepted this the way he accepted most things about himself, not with drama, not with the weight that adults tended to project onto it. Just information cataloged, integrated. This is what I am. Interesting. Can I touch the diagnostic light now? He said. Miriam glanced at Sirius, who raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which was his version of up to you. Carefully, she said. And tell me exactly what you feel when you do. Harry reached out and pressed one finger into the diagnostic light still hovering above his own mapping. The color shifted immediately from the standard gold-green of active diagnostic magic to something warmer, more amber, with threads of deep violet running through it that Miriam had never seen in any diagnostic result in 19 years. It feels like the door again, he said, but the door's already open, It just wants to know where to go. He moved his finger slightly, tracing a line in the light. The violet threads followed his movement. There's a direction it wants to go, sort of south and down, not a physical direction, more like a dimensional orientation, Miriam said quietly. She was watching the light change with the expression of someone watching something extraordinary with full awareness that they are watching something extraordinary, like a vector in magical space. Yes, Harry said, satisfied. Like that. She wrote for 3 minutes without stopping. Harry watched the light drift slowly back to its baseline color, violet fading, and withdrew his hand and looked at it with that considering expression. It tickles, he said. Petunia came by at noon with sandwiches, which was her version of involvement. She didn't come into the flat, had never, in 3 years, crossed the threshold of Sirius's flat, which both of them found easier. But she left a covered plate on the doorstep, which Sirius brought in with the particular diplomatic neutrality he developed for everything regarding Petunia. The relationship between Sirius Black and Petunia Dursley was one of the more improbable things in Harry's life, which was saying something. They had managed over 3 years a kind of careful functional cohabitation of Harry's world that required both of them to make significant adjustments to their default natures. Sirius to his instinct toward bluntness and volume, Petunia to her instinct toward fear and control, and had arrived at something that wasn't warmth but was, genuinely, a working arrangement. Petunia was afraid of Harry. Sirius had understood this early and had spent 3 years trying to decide how much patience it deserved and how much it needed to be challenged. She wasn't cruel. He'd watch for that with the vigilance of a man who had very clear ideas about what he'd do if he found it. But she kept a distance from Harry that was too consistent to be anything other than chosen. She fed him, clothed him, badly, in Dudley's cast-offs, which Sirius was still working on, and met his basic needs with a reliability that spoke to some core sense of duty. But she never reached for him, never sat with him the way parents sat, never asked questions about him that weren't essentially, is he going to cause problems? Harry had noticed. He'd never said anything specific about it to Sirius. He didn't tend toward complaint, but there was a particular quality to how Harry interacted with Petunia, a careful consideration that was more adult than anything a 4-year-old should have needed to develop. Like he'd learned the shape of her fear and was navigating around it. Like he'd made peace with a thing before the thing was fully knowable. It made Sirius want to hit something, periodically. He didn't. He ate his sandwich and watched Harry tell Miriam about the plant leaning, speaking with his hands, and thought about the parents Harry didn't have, and the life Harry was building in the space left by their absence, and felt the familiar grief-adjacent thing that wasn't quite grief but lived in the same house. After lunch, while Miriam wrote up her case notes with the focused intensity she always brought to post-diagnostic documentation, Harry found Sirius in the kitchen and stood in the doorway, watching him wash up with the look that meant he had a question he was deciding whether to ask. Sirius didn't prompt him. He'd learned that prompting made Harry file the question away. He just washed up and waited. At school, Harry said eventually. Sirius turned around. Piers Palkas told everyone my parents died in a car crash. He said this with no particular emotional weight, just reporting. Aunt Petunia told him that. I know, Sirius said. That's not what happened. No, my dad didn't drive drunk. He said this with just a hint of something underneath the even delivery, not anger, but a quiet precision, the way you say something true that you're tired of having be uncertain. He didn't do anything wrong. No, Sirius said. He didn't. He was brave and he died protecting you and your mum. He dried his hands. Your aunt says what she says because she doesn't know how to say the true thing to people who wouldn't understand it. Harry considered this. That's not a good reason. No, Sirius agreed, it's not. It's a human reason, though. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table. Come here. Harry came and sat, and Sirius sat across from him, and this was the thing about Sirius Black as a godfather that no ministry file and no Azkaban sentence had managed to touch. He looked at this boy fully. Not past him, not at the scar on his forehead or the readings on a diagnostic instrument. At Harry specifically and entirely. Your dad's name was James, he said, and he was the most infuriating, brilliant, loyal person I ever knew. He laughed too loudly and he was terrible at potions, and he once convinced the entire Gryffindor Quidditch team to wear their robes inside out for a week on a bet, and he loved your mum like it was a full-time occupation. He paused. Your mum's name was Lily. She was smarter than any 3 people I've ever met, and she had a temper that could strip the paint off a wall, and she made the best tea I've ever tasted, and she would have walked through fire for the people she loved without stopping to think about whether she should. Harry was very still, not sad, not exactly. That particular stillness that was him holding something and letting it settle in. They sound nice, he said. They were, Sirius said, and there was nothing more to say to that, so he didn't say anything more. The afternoon brought something new. Harry was in the back garden, Flowers still leaning, old news at this point, and Miriam was inside packing up, and Sirius was theoretically reading, but actually watching Harry through the kitchen window, with the half attention of someone who'd learned that Harry's quiet afternoons were often more instructive than his active ones. Harry had found a beetle. He was crouched over it the way he'd been crouched over the flowers, hands not quite touching it, that same focused expression. The beetle was doing the beetle equivalent of being confused, turning in small circles, stopping, turning again. And the air around Harry's hands had that faint shimmer that Sirius had started noticing about 6 months ago, and had mentioned to Miriam, who had noted it in her file with the thoroughness she brought to everything. The shimmer was new, not the shimmer itself that had been there a few months. What was new was the radius. 6 months ago it was the width of his palms. Now it extended roughly a foot in every direction. Sirius set down his book. The beetle stopped turning in circles. It oriented, suddenly and with unusual deliberateness for a beetle, toward Harry's hands. And then Harry did something Sirius had never seen him do before. He pushed. Not physically, just something in the shimmer changed quality, went directional in the way Miriam had been theorizing, and the beetle lifted off the ground. Not jumped, lifted. Smoothly, 3 inches, hovering in the shimmery air with its legs going with the gentle bewilderment of a creature that had not consulted its expectations and found them violated. Harry stared at the floating beetle with the pure, uncomplicated delight of a child discovering something entirely new, and then he looked at the window. He and Sirius looked at each other through the glass. Sirius held up one finger, hold on, and turned and went to the foot of the stairs. "Miriam," he said. Something in his voice brought her to the top of the stairs with her bag still unzipped. She looked at his face and then came down. They went to the kitchen window together. Harry was still crouching in the garden. The beetle was still floating. He had his chin slightly tilted up now, that particular expression of someone paying close attention to the mechanics of what they're doing, committing the feeling of it to memory. Miriam put one hand on the window sill. The other hand found her case notes parchment, apparently on instinct. "That's not accidental," she said. "No," Sirius said. "It's really not. He's 4 years old." "I know, Miriam." Wandless magical manipulation of physical objects requires a level of intentional magical output that most children can't manage before 8 or 9 at the earliest. With a wand. She was writing already, leaning the parchment against the window frame. "He's doing it with no focal point, no incantation, no training. He's been practicing on the plants," Sirius said. "I thought it was accidental magic, the leaning." "I don't think any of it has been accidental," Miriam said quietly, "for some time." In the garden, Harry gently lowered the beetle back to the ground. He watched it for a moment. It oriented itself, shook out its wing casings in what looked like dignified composure, and walked away. Harry sat back on his heels and looked at his hands again. Then he looked at the window again, and this time he smiled. It was the same smile as that first one, the sudden, bright transformation of his face, but the eyes were different. Not a baby's eyes, something older in them. Not old like worn out or burdened, but old like deep, like there were levels to him that hadn't finished being built yet and wouldn't for some time. Miriam had been tracking Harry's development for 3 years. She thought she'd understood the general arc of what was happening inside him. She thought the resonance architecture's effects were a gradually accelerating process, following a slope she could model if not predict with precision. The beetle changed her estimate, not the act itself, the eyes. The eyes looking through the window with that particular quality that said, "I know what I did, I know what it means." "I am not surprised. He'd been doing this or something like it for a while. He'd chosen now to let them see it. 4 years old, she thought, and he's already managing his own disclosure. She wrote that down too. That evening, after Miriam had gone and the sandwich plate was back on Petunia's doorstep, and Harry was asleep in his room at the Dursleys, Sirius sat in the flat's kitchen with a glass of whiskey. He'd been nursing for an hour and the latest curse theory notes spread on the table. The notes were getting extensive. 3 years of collaborative research, his own analytical work on curse architecture, Miriam's clinical documentation, the correspondence with 4 academic contacts who didn't know exactly what they were consulting on but were sharp enough to provide useful theoretical frameworks regardless. He'd filled 8 notebooks. His handwriting covered every margin. He was looking at the resonance architecture diagram he'd been building, a careful reconstruction of what the curse mapping showed in geometric terms, and he was thinking about what Harry had said at lunch. Mum didn't put them there. She just changed what they were doing. The most basic principle of dark curse conversion, as far as any of the theory they'd found discussed it, was that you couldn't make it passive. The converting system needed to be constantly doing something with the energy it processed. It couldn't store it indefinitely. A static resonance architecture would saturate and fail, which meant the magical core readings made perfect sense. Harry's core wasn't growing in spite of the 400 curses. It was growing because of them. Every dark magical element that touched him, every curse in his bones processing and converting was output, fuel, the plants leaning. The diagnostic light changing color, the beetle lifting 3 inches off the ground with the careful precision of a child who'd been practicing. It wasn't building towards something. It was already something. Sirius looked at his notes and then looked at the ceiling and thought about James Potter, who had once thrown himself in front of 3 upper-year Slytherins who were hexing a second-year Muggle-born he'd never met, with no wand because he'd been heading to the lake for a swim, and thought about Lily Potter, who had sat in the library the night after their 5th-year defense exam, when everyone else was celebrating, and quietly worked through every single problem she'd gotten wrong because I want to know what the right answer is, not just that I got it wrong, and thought about the specific combination of those 2 people that was currently asleep 2 streets away, and had levitated a beetle this afternoon, with the satisfaction of someone checking off an item on an internal list nobody else had seen. He picked up his quill and wrote in the margin of the diagram in large enough letters that he'd see it tomorrow, not a weapon, not a victim, something else entirely. Pay attention. He underlined it twice. Then he added below it in smaller letters. She knew. Lily knew exactly what she was building. He sat with this for a while. The whiskey slowly reached room temperature. The flat was quiet and the street outside was quiet, and somewhere in this neighborhood, a 4-year-old boy slept with 400 ancient dark curses in his bones and a magical core that had just broken level 19 in hands that could lift things without touching them, and none of the adults in his life fully understood what came next. What Sirius was sure of, the thing he would bet everything he had left, was that it was going to be extraordinary. He closed his notebook. He washed his glass. He went to bed. In the morning, Harry would have questions. He always had questions, and the questions were always better than the answers Sirius had managed to prepare for the day before, which meant that tomorrow, like every day for 3 years, Sirius Black would find himself slightly outpaced by a child who was making himself, very carefully and very deliberately, out of the most improbable raw material in the history of magic. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 4. Voss the man arrived on a Wednesday in late September, which Harry knew because Wednesday was when Sirius went into London for his standing meeting with the lawyer, which meant Harry was at the Dursley house for the afternoon with Petunia, which meant he was in the back garden reading while Dudley watched television inside and Petunia pruned things that didn't need pruning. Harry was 7 now. He was reading a book on theoretical geometry that Sirius had found in a second-hand shop and bought on the basis that Harry had asked what topology meant after seeing a word in a newspaper. And Harry had been working through it for 3 days with the methodical pleasure he brought to anything that gave him a new framework for thinking about shape and space and direction. He had a particular interest in things that behaved differently than they looked like they should. He was on page 64 when the front gate clicked. He didn't look up immediately. The postman came at 11, Petunia's friend Mrs. Figg occasionally stopped by, and the meter reader came every quarter. All of these had distinct sounds, different gates' latches, different footsteps on the path. This was none of those. Harry set his book face down and looked. The man coming up the path was about 45, with a lean, precise quality to how he moved that was less like someone walking and more like someone arriving at a calculated destination. He wore a dark gray Muggle suit that fit well enough to be deliberate. Someone who knew Muggle clothing and had chosen it specifically, which meant either a Muggle-born or someone performing Muggle. His hair was very short, brown going gray at the temples. He carried a slim briefcase and wore small, rectangular glasses, and had the look of someone who did everything efficiently, and had the professional patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting as long as necessary. He wasn't from the Ministry. Harry knew the Ministry look. He'd seen enough of Miriam's Ministry-adjacent contacts over the years to recognize that particular blend of self-importance and bureaucratic anxiety. This man was from the Ministry the way a scalpel was from a surgery, technically true, but the specific thing in a way that mattered. Harry picked his book back up. Petunia had appeared at the front door with the expression she reserved for unexpected visitors. Harry heard the man's voice, smooth, professionally warm, the kind of voice that had been calibrated, say something about a welfare check, Ministry of Magic, standard procedure. Petunia's voice went tight in the way it went tight when she was trying to be cooperative about something she found deeply unwelcome. The man came inside. The door closed. Harry read 2 more pages of his topology book, then set it down again, stood up, brushed grass off his jeans, and went inside. The man was sitting in the Dursley sitting room in the armchair that was Petunia's best armchair, and which she only ever directed guests to when she was performing hospitality while actually being furious. He had his briefcase on his knees and a cup of tea on the side table that Petunia had clearly produced on autopilot. He was looking at a folder of papers with the posture of someone who was comfortable in other people's sitting rooms. He looked up when Harry came in. Harry looked at him. In the 2 seconds of this exchange, before the man had said anything, before any social scaffolding was erected, Harry ran the same rapid assessment he ran on everyone new. It was not a conscious checklist. It was a thing that had developed over years of watching Sirius assess people, and Miriam assess people, and the steady accumulation of being a child in a world where adults were constantly deciding things about him. The man was not hostile. That was the first thing. Not the studied neutrality of someone suppressing something, but genuine baseline calm. He was also not here by chance or routine. There was a quality of preparation about him, a specific readiness, the body language of someone who has thought about this moment. He was interested. That was the third thing, and it was the thing Harry filed most carefully. Not interested the way journalists were interested, or the way certain wizarding parents had looked at him when Sirius took him to Diagon Alley for the first time last year. Those were interests in the scar, the name, the symbol. This man was interested in Harry, or thought he was, which meant he knew something. "Hello," the man said. His voice was exactly what it had sounded like through the window. "You must be Harry." "Yes," Harry said. He came into the room and sat on the sofa across from him. Not perched nervously, not sprawling comfortably, just sat, with the particular quality of occupying a space fully that people didn't usually see in 7-year-olds, and that Harry had never thought of as unusual because it was simply how he sat. Petunia had appeared in the doorway. Her eyes moved from Harry to the man and back. Harry could read her expression. She wanted Harry away from this, and also she wanted this resolved without incident, and these two desires were in direct conflict. "It's fine, Aunt Petunia," Harry said. She looked at him with the particular helpless exasperation that was the most genuine thing she ever directed at him, and went back to the kitchen. The man watched this with a quality of attention that confirmed what Harry had already decided. He noticed things. He filed them. He was drawing conclusions. "My name is Aldrich Voss," the man said. He opened the folder on his briefcase, casual, unhurried. "I'm from the Ministry of Magic, the Department of Families and Child Welfare." He glanced at his papers. "This is a standard review visit. We check in periodically on children in unusual placements." "What department did you say?" Harry asked. A fractional pause. "Families and Child Welfare. Can I see your identification?" The pause this time was less fractional. Something moved in the man's expression. Not irritation, not surprise exactly, more the micro-adjustment of someone who had prepared for several opening scenarios and was recalibrating toward a less common one. He reached inside his jacket and produced a ministry card. He leaned forward and held it out. Harry took it. Read it. The card was perfectly produced, good ministry seal, all the right information in the right format. Aldrich Voss, Senior Welfare Officer, MFCW. The card was real. The identification was real. The department designation was the thing that wasn't. Harry handed it back. The Department of Families and Child Welfare is on the 4th level, Harry said. Their visitors generally come at prearranged times and send an owl first. You didn't send an owl. Voss took the card back. Sometimes we do unannounced visits. It gives a more accurate picture. Also, Harry said, I know the names of everyone who's been assigned to my case file at MFCW. Miriam Thorne gave me the list last year. He paused. Your name isn't on it. Silence. Voss looked at him. Harry looked back. The thing about Voss was that he was very good at not showing things, which Harry could tell not because he failed at it, but because the quality of his control was itself informative. People who had nothing to hide didn't maintain that level of careful neutrality. The neutrality was a performance, and performances took effort, and effort left traces. You're very well informed, Voss said. Yes, Harry said, for a 7-year-old. I've had good teachers. Voss set his folder down on the briefcase. It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one, putting away the props, adjusting the approach. Harry watched him do it and noted it and waited. All right, Voss said. He said it with a kind of measured respect, the tone shifting from professionally warm to something more direct, which Harry found considerably more interesting. Let me be straightforward with you, Harry. Please, Harry said. I am from the ministry. I am not from MFCW. He didn't look uncomfortable about having been caught. That was interesting too. I'm from a department that doesn't appear in the standard ministry directory. We work on cases that require, he chose the word with the precision of someone who'd thought about this sentence, a more specialized framework. Department of Mysteries, Harry said. Another fractional pause. What makes you say that? You have the same quality of attention as the unspeakables who came to St. Mungo's when I was a baby, Harry said. Miriam described them. She said they watch things the way instruments watch things. Like they were recording rather than just seeing. He looked at Voss. You watch like that. Something in Voss's eyes changed. Not alarm, Harry didn't think Voss did alarm in the conventional sense. More like the specific kind of attention that meant he'd heard something that was going to rearrange his model. You know about the St. Mungo's incident, Voss said. I know about most things that concern me, Harry said. Sirius Black. Yes. And Healer Thorne. Yes. Voss looked at him for a moment. Outside, a car passed on Privet Drive. The television in the next room was a murmur of cartoon sound effects. The sitting room held the two of them and the particular quality of silence that exists between people engaged in a very careful conversation. You understand why I'm here, Voss said. It wasn't a question. You want to know what I can do, Harry said. You've been watching my case since the beginning, probably since before the beginning, probably since Godric's Hollow. He tilted his head. The Department of Mysteries was interested in my parents' work, my mother specifically. You've been tracking what's been happening inside me since the diagnostic at St. Mungo's or before. You want to understand the resonance architecture. The silence that followed this was longer than the previous ones. Where did you hear that term? Voss said, and now there was something underneath his voice that wasn't quite sharp but was in the same family. Not anger. Something more like being genuinely caught off balance, which Harry suspected happened rarely. I found it in Miriam's research notes, Harry said. She didn't show me intentionally. I was 7 months ago. I was 6. I read quickly. Voss sat back in the armchair. He looked at Harry with an expression that had given up most of its professional scaffolding and was something much more direct underneath. Genuinely interested. Genuinely recalibrated. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? A child, Voss said. A remarkable child, certainly. The diagnostic data suggested extraordinary magical development, but he paused, seeming to choose honesty, which Harry respected. The data doesn't capture this. What is this? You, Voss said simply, the way you're having this conversation. Harry looked at him steadily. "What do you want?" Voss was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone deciding how much honesty was strategically correct and then deciding slightly more than that. "I want to understand what your mother built," he said. "I want to understand the resonance architecture as a theoretical framework and as a living phenomenon. The Department of Mysteries has been working on curse conversion theory for 60 years, and we have never observed anything remotely like what your diagnostic mapping shows." He stopped. "You are a genuinely unprecedented event, Harry." "I know," Harry said, "and that doesn't concern you, should it?" Voss considered this. "Most people find it concerning to be unprecedented." Most people didn't have 3 years of Sirius telling them that being unprecedented is interesting rather than frightening, Harry said, and let the edges of a smile appear, which was as much as the situation warranted. "And Miriam treating every new development like it's a puzzle she gets to solve." He looked at Voss. "What would you want from me specifically if I were to have this conversation properly?" Another recalibration. Voss set his briefcase aside, and the shift was significant. He was closing the distance between the role and the person, which either meant he was very good at manipulation or genuinely responding to the conversation. Harry wasn't sure yet which it was and noted the uncertainty. "Access," Voss said. "Not to you physically, to your diagnostic data with Healer Thorne's cooperation. To you, academically, conversations with your full knowledge and consent about your experience of what's happening inside you. The department has research that could help Thorne's work, could help you potentially understand what the architecture is building toward." "You think you know what it's building toward," Harry said. "We have theories." "What are they?" Voss looked at him. "You want me to tell you now? You came here for information. That's an exchange, not a gift." Harry's voice was entirely even. "If you want access to what's mine, you tell me what you know." The silence this time was different from the previous ones. Less guarded, more thoughtful. Voss had the expression of someone genuinely reassessing the terms of an encounter. "You're 7, he said, not negatively, almost to himself. "Yes," Harry said. "What are the theories?" Voss talked for 40 minutes. Harry listened with his hands in his lap and his eyes on Voss's face, tracking not just what was being said but how it was being said, where the hesitations were, where the language got careful, where the genuine enthusiasm of someone who had spent years on a problem leaked through the professional presentation. That last category was the most useful. People told you what they actually cared about when they forgot to be careful. Voss cared about the architecture itself. Deeply, genuinely cared about it in the way researchers care about elegant problems. Not about Harry, not about the implications, but about the mechanism. The theoretical beauty of it. Harry noticed this and didn't file it as dangerous exactly, but filed it as a thing that meant Voss's interests and Harry's interests were not the same thing, even when they overlapped. The theories were this. The Department of Mysteries had been working on Lily Potter's research independently, pulling from her published academic work and from what they could reconstruct of her theoretical notes through ministry channels. They believed the resonance architecture was a development of a concept Lily had begun exploring in her 3rd year of magical theory at Oxford. The idea that dark magic wasn't fundamentally different from light magic in composition, only in direction. That the difference was a vector problem rather than a substance problem. If that was right, the architecture wasn't converting dark magic into light magic. It was redirecting it, taking magic with an existing direction, toward harm, toward destruction, and rotating the vector. The output would be the same magnitude of magical energy as the input, traveling in a different direction. The 400 curses weren't disappearing. They were being redirected through Harry's body and coming out as something else. "As what?" Harry said. "That," Voss said, and for the first time something that wasn't professional composure crossed his face, something that looked very much like wonder, which Harry had not expected from him, "is what we don't know. The magnitude of output we'd expect from 400 active dark curses, continuously converting since you were 14 months old, is," he paused. "There isn't a number in our standard framework that meaningfully describes it. Healer Thorne's core readings are already off every scale we have. By our projections, by the time you're 11, 12, he stopped. "Say it," Harry said. "By the time you're 11 or 12, Voss said, Your output capacity will be without precedent in recorded wizarding history. Not by a small margin, by an order of magnitude. Harry sat with this. Outside, the cartoon murmur from the television had become what sounded like Dudley having a minor tantrum about something, quickly resolved by Petunia's voice going sharp. Privet Drive, ordinary afternoon, the usual small furniture of his daily life, and a man sitting across from him telling him what 400 dark curses had been making him into for 7 years. "Okay," Harry said. Voss looked at him. "Okay. I already knew it was something significant," Harry said. "Miriam's face every quarterly diagnostic is very informative." He looked at his hands. "What does the department want to do with that information?" "Understand it," Voss said. "Document it, learn from it." He paused. "Protect it. From what? From people who would want to direct it." Voss's voice was even. "What you're describing, what you're becoming, would be enormously useful to anyone with ambitions that required that kind of power. Voldemort's remaining supporters, others. People who don't need to believe in Voldemort specifically to recognize the value of what you carry." Harry looked at him. "You're describing yourself," he said. "Among others." The pause. "Yes," Voss said. "Among others." The honesty of it was either very stupid or very calculated, and Voss didn't seem like a stupid man. Harry thought about this. "You want to be the ones who direct it," Harry said. "Not through force, through relationship. Through being the people who were helpful and honest and there early so that when it matters there's a connection." He watched Voss's face. "That's not a terrible strategy." "It's not a strategy," Voss said. It's a strategy," Harry said, not unkindly. "That's all right. People have strategies. Dumbledore has one. Sirius has one. Miriam has one." He looked at the window. The afternoon light was doing the particular September thing of going amber earlier than it should. "The difference is whether the strategy requires me to be what you need, or whether it makes room for what I'm actually going to be." Voss was very quiet. "I don't know what I'm going to be yet," Harry said. "I'm 7. But I know that already, and I noticed that you were talking about my capacity as a thing that exists independently of whether I choose to use it, like it's a resource." He looked back at Voss. "It's mine. It's inside my bones, and it's what my mother made, and it's mine. Whatever direction it ends up going, that's a decision I'll make." He paused. "I'm not hostile to you. I'm not going to tell Sirius this conversation happened to make it go away, but I wanted you to know I understand what you're doing." Voss sat back. He looked at Harry for a long moment with an expression that had completely abandoned its initial presentation, and was now something Harry couldn't quite read, complex, layered, the expression of a man doing rapid internal revision. "Sirius Black taught you to talk like this," he said. "Sirius taught me to say what I think," Harry said. "Miriam taught me to be precise about it. The topology book I was reading when you arrived is helping with the framework." He tilted his head. "Will you tell me what you actually know about what happens at 12? Specifically?" The conversation ran another 20 minutes. Voss talked, and Harry listened, and the information that came through was genuinely useful, better than anything in Miriam's notes, fuller than Sirius's theoretical reconstructions, the product of 60 years of department research on curse conversion that had suddenly, 3 years ago, become urgently relevant to the specific case of Harry Potter. At critical resonance, the point at which the architecture completed its primary conversion cycle, which Voss estimated at age 10 to 12 based on the progression data, every curse in the structure would activate simultaneously, not destructively. Lily's design, as far as the department understood it, had built in a completion event rather than a catastrophic one. "What kind of completion event?" Harry said. "We don't know the specifics," Voss said, and Harry heard the honesty in it. "We know the theoretical endpoint from the resonance architecture framework. It's described in the ancient texts. A full integration. The converted energy stops being a separate system inside the host and becomes part of them, completely. Not stored in the bones separately but diffused through every system, magical and biological." Harry considered this. "That sounds like it would feel like something." "Almost certainly," Voss said. "Is it dangerous?" "We don't know." He met Harry's eyes. "That's the honest answer. We don't know because it's never been done before. Lily Potter designed something that has never existed in the history of magic, and it is building toward a completion event that we cannot fully model because there's no precedent." He paused. What we're fairly sure of is that trying to stop it or interrupt it would be considerably more dangerous than letting it complete. Harry nodded slowly. He felt, hearing this, a kind of internal stillness, not fear. Not even particularly much surprise. More the feeling of something clicking into a shape he'd been able to half see for a while, now made clear. His mother had built something with an ending point. There was a moment coming when it would finish. The curses in his bones were not going to be there permanently. They were scaffolding, Sirius had theorized once, and this confirmed it. Scaffolding for building something. When the building was done, the scaffolding would go. What would be left was what had been built. I want Miriam to see this information, Harry said, and Sirius. That would require the department to make contact officially rather than by unannounced welfare check, Harry said, which is what should have happened from the beginning. He looked at Voss. You've been watching this case for 7 years. You've been passive because watching was more useful than engaging. You came today because the progression rate has reached a point where passive watching isn't enough. You need to be in the conversation. He paused. Make contact properly. Come to Miriam. Bring your research. Offer the exchange formally, not through me on an ordinary Wednesday. Voss looked at him. You're telling me how to approach this, he said. I'm telling you how to approach it if you want it to work, Harry said. Sirius is not going to respond well to you regardless. That's probably not resolvable, and you should plan around it rather than through it. Miriam will be hostile initially, but she's fundamentally a scientist, and if your research is good, she'll eventually talk to you about the work even if she doesn't trust your department. He stood up from the sofa. She will have opinions about how my medical care interfaces with your research interests. You should let her have them. Voss stood as well, somewhat automatically, the way people stood when someone definitively changed the energy of a room. And you, he said, what will you do? I'll keep reading, Harry said, and I'll talk to Sirius, and I'll think about what you said. He picked up his topology book from the coffee table where he'd set it when he came in. And when the time comes and the department wants to be part of this properly, I'll decide whether that's useful. You'll decide, Voss said. Something in his voice was still doing the thing Harry had been tracking, the careful control over genuine reaction. Yes, Harry said. I'll decide. He looked at the man steadily with the same even regard he'd given the floating beetle in the garden. Curious, proprietorial, mine, it's my architecture. He walked to the sitting room door, stopped. Mr. Voss, he said without turning around. Yes. The next time you do a welfare check on a 7-year-old, you should probably know they might read your credentials, a pause, and their mother's research notes. He went into the kitchen to find his aunt. Sirius was back by 6. Harry was in the garden again, not doing anything with the plants this time, just sitting, his topology book abandoned beside him and his hands loose in his lap. Sirius came through the back gate and took one look at him and went inside. Came back out 2 minutes later with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat down in the garden chair. He waited. Harry told him about Voss. All of it, the identification check, the Department of Mysteries admission, the 60 years of curse conversion research, the completion event, the projection for age 11 or 12. He told it in order, without editorial, the way Miriam had taught him to report diagnostic observations. Just the sequence of what had happened and what had been said. When he finished, Sirius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You handled that yourself." "Yes, you didn't call me. You were in London and it was fine." Harry looked at him. "I was fine." Sirius put his lemonade glass down on the arm of the chair. He was doing the thing he did sometimes, the thing Harry recognized as Sirius having a strong feeling and choosing what to do with it. It usually ended one of 2 ways. Something expansive and noisy, or very quiet and direct. This time it went quiet. "He came to see what you are," Sirius said. "Yes." And instead he saw who you are. He said it simply. Harry thought about this. "Is there a difference?" "Enormous one," Sirius said. "What you are is data, power levels, curse architecture, theoretical framework." He picked up his lemonade again. "Who you are is the person who told a Department of Mysteries unspeakable how to do his job properly before he'd been in the house an hour." He looked at Harry with those gray eyes that had something warm in them alongside everything else. "Your dad would have been beside himself with pride. Your mum would have made you write up the full interaction and critique your own approach afterward. That sounds right, Harry said. It's extremely right. Sirius was quiet for a moment. The completion event. Yes, you're not scared. Harry thought about this honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. No, he said. It feels like information, like knowing a thing is coming and being able to prepare for it, which is better than not knowing. He looked at the garden, the flowers doing their gentle lean in the early evening light. It's mine. Whatever it is, it's mine. Mum made it for me. He paused. That part I was already sure of. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly, she did. They sat in the garden as the light went amber, and then gold, and then the particular deep blue of a September evening coming in from the east. And Sirius thought about Lily Potter with her extraordinary mind and her impossible ideas. And Harry sat beside him building the geometry of what was coming in the private space of his own thoughts. And the flowers leaned steadily in the cooling air, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Somewhere in London, in a building that didn't appear in any Muggle directory, Godric Voss was writing a report. Harry was fairly certain it was going to be the most surprised report the Department of Mysteries had received in a very long time. That was all right. He'd meant every word of what he'd said. Chapter 5. 401 the morning it happened, Harry was making breakfast, not because anyone had asked him to. Petunia made breakfast on school days with the mechanical efficiency of someone running a schedule, and Sirius made breakfast on weekend with the chaos of someone who found cooking philosophically interesting and practically challenging. But it was a Saturday in late October, and Sirius was still asleep, and Harry had been awake since 5, which happened sometimes. Not insomnia, not anxiety, just the feeling of being too alert for the available hour, his mind running ahead of the rest of the world. He was 10 years old and he had learned to work with his own rhythms rather than against them. He made toast, found the marmalade, put the kettle on. Outside the kitchen window of Sirius's flat, the October morning was doing the thing October mornings did best, a specific quality of pale gold light that made ordinary things look briefly significant. The neighbor's cat was on the fence. A bus went past on the main road 2 streets over. The world was exactly itself. Then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sound or a light or a pain. It was more like pressure equalizing. Like when you've been climbing and your ears finally adjust and the world becomes slightly more present, slightly more three-dimensional, and you realize the previous version of hearing had been missing something you didn't know was missing. Harry set down his piece of toast. He stood in the kitchen and paid attention to what was happening inside him, the way Miriam had spent 6 years teaching him to pay attention to it, carefully, precisely, without either panic or excessive interpretation. Just, what is this specifically right now? The curses were moving, not randomly, not chaotically. They were moving the way a tide moves, all of it at once in the same direction, with the slow, enormous certainty of something following a physical law rather than making a decision. Every bone in his body, from his skull to his feet, carrying the same information at the same moment. It was time. Harry exhaled slowly through his nose. "Sirius," he called. His voice came out completely normal. He was proud of that. Sirius appeared at the kitchen door in 30 seconds, which meant he'd been more awake than he'd seemed. He was still in yesterday's clothes, hair everywhere, but his eyes were sharp, and he took one look at Harry standing very still beside the kitchen counter and was across the room in 2 strides. "What?" he said. "It's starting," Harry said. "I think it's the completion event." He paused. "I'm not in pain. I want to say that first." Sirius had his hand on Harry's shoulder and was looking at him with the particular intensity that he usually kept under his casual surface and only deployed when it actually mattered. His face was doing complicated things very quickly. "How do you know?" "Everything's moving. All at once, same direction." Harry pressed one hand flat against his own sternum. Under his palm, he could feel his heartbeat, steady, and underneath that something else, a deep vibration, below the frequency of sound, the feeling of an enormous mechanism making its final rotation. "It's not painful. It feels like resolution." Sirius pulled out his wand. "I'm calling Miriam." "Yes," Harry said, "and maybe keep that nearby." He nodded at the wand. "Are you worried?" Sirius said over his shoulder, already at the fireplace. Harry thought about this honestly. "No," he said. "I'm paying attention." The distinction seemed to satisfy Sirius in some way because his shoulders did a fractional thing that wasn't quite relaxing, but was choosing to hold the current assessment rather than escalating. He threw flue powder in the fireplace and called Miriam's name. She arrived in 11 minutes, which, Harry calculated, meant she'd been ready to arrive in 11 minutes for some time. Her bag was already packed. Her reading glasses were on her head, and her diagnostic instruments were in the side pocket in the ready position. She came through the fireplace and looked at Harry standing at the kitchen table and did her reading, the quick professional assessment she did every time she saw him, so practiced it was almost invisible, and then she set her bag down and crossed to him. "Talk to me," she said. Harry told her what he'd told Sirius. She listened with her full attention, asking precise questions, timing, quality of movement, whether it felt different in different parts of his skeleton, whether there was any heat or cold associated with it. He answered each one accurately, finding the right language, and as he spoke she ran a baseline diagnostic with one hand, reading the results almost in real time. She went still when she read them. "It's happening everywhere simultaneously," she said, not to anyone specifically. Reading aloud, the way she did when she was processing something too large to hold in her head silently. Full cascade activation. Every curse, same phase. She looked at him. "It's been building to this since it must have been synchronizing. The individual activations I've been reading quarterly, the acceleration over the last 18 months. They were all moving toward the same moment," Harry said. "Yes. How long do you think we have before the completion point?" Harry checked in with the internal movement again. The tide was slow and enormous and very certain. "I don't know exactly. Hours maybe. I don't think it's immediate." He paused. "It doesn't feel urgent. It feels patient." "Patient," Miriam repeated and wrote it down. Sirius was in the doorway with tea he'd made while they talked, distributing it with the practicality of a man who needed to do something physical with his hands. He gave Harry his mug and looked at Miriam. "What does she need?" he said, meaning what did she need from him? "Space to work," Miriam said, "and someone to contact Dumbledore." Sirius's jaw tightened briefly. "Does Dumbledore need to be?" "He has information we don't," Miriam said, not unkindly. "Voss's research, what the department shared after Harry's meeting, it's been 3 years, Sirius. Whatever else is true about how Dumbledore has managed this situation, he has 60 years of cross-referenced curse conversion theory that I can't reconstruct in the next few hours." She looked at him steadily. "Contact him. Tell him it's today." A beat of silence. "Fine," Sirius said, and went to the fireplace. Dumbledore arrived 40 minutes later, stepping out of the fireplace with the particular quality he always had of filling a room without appearing to do so, not physically large, not dramatically costumed, just very present in a way that most people weren't. He was wearing deep blue robes and his half-moon glasses, and he looked at Harry the way he always looked at Harry, which was with an affection and a complexity, and something that wasn't guilt exactly, but was in the same family. Something that knew a cost. Harry had met him 4 times over the past 3 years. He'd made his own assessments. He'd asked Sirius and Miriam, and even once Augusta Longbottom what they thought of Albus Dumbledore, and he'd gotten 4 very different answers that were all simultaneously true, which told him most of what he needed to know about how complicated the man was. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Professor," Harry said because it felt like the right register, formal but not hostile. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "How are you feeling?" "Functional," Harry said. "Better than that, actually." "I feel well." He paused. "I know you have research from the department. Miriam needs it." Dumbledore glanced at Miriam. "Yes," he said simply. He opened his robes and produced, from what appeared to be an internal pocket with considerably more depth than the outside of the garment suggested, a folder of parchment that was considerably thicker than anything you'd expect to carry in a breast pocket. He set it on the table in front of Miriam. "Everything I have. Voss's theoretical projections, the department's modeling for the completion event, the historical analysis of the original resonance architecture texts." He sat down at the kitchen table. "I want to be useful today if that's permitted." The last 2 words were directed at Harry, not at Sirius or Miriam. Harry noticed this and noted it. "Yes," Harry said. "Tell me what you actually think happens at the completion point." Dumbledore took off his glasses, cleaned them once, put them back. It was a human gesture from a man who didn't make many unintentional ones, and Harry thought it might be genuine. "I think," Dumbledore said carefully, "that what your mother built was a self-dismantling structure. The curses process and convert and feed your core until the conversion architecture is no longer needed because what it was building is complete. Then the architecture, the curses themselves, as distinct structures dissolve. The scaffolding comes down. And what's been built," Harry said, "is you," Dumbledore said. "A fully integrated version of you in which the converted magic is not stored separately in your bones but is simply part of your fundamental magical architecture. Part of who you are at the deepest level." He paused. "Your mother was extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly brilliant, Harry. She didn't give you a weapon, she gave you a foundation." The kitchen was quiet. Sirius was leaning against the wall near the fireplace with his arms crossed, saying nothing, watching Dumbledore with the expression of a man who had complicated feelings about the person he was looking at and had decided to hold them for later. Miriam was reading through the folder with the speed of someone who'd been waiting for this specific information for 6 years. "The number," Harry said to Dumbledore, 400 curses, was that specific. "Did she choose it?" "Not exactly," Dumbledore said. "She chose the architecture. The number arose naturally from the scope of the killing curse she was working with, its composition, the dark magical elements embedded in it. She designed the structure to absorb and use everything the curse carried." He paused. 401, technically. Harry looked at him. "The 400 curses in the killing curse's composition," Dumbledore said. "And the act of love itself, which she built into the architecture as the initiating mechanism, the mechanism that started everything." He held Harry's gaze. "Her death, her choice, that was the 401st element." The kitchen was very still. Harry thought about his mother, who he had no memory of but had been building a picture of for 10 years from everyone who'd known her, brilliant, warm, relentless, capable of things that shouldn't have been possible. He thought about her standing in a room in Godric's Hollow and deciding, in whatever time she had, to make something out of what was coming, not to stop it, to use it. He thought she knew she was going to die, and she spent her last moments building him something to grow into. He picked up his tea mug. His hands were steady. "All right," he said. "All right," Sirius said from the wall. "I understand what's happening," Harry said. "I know what it is. I know what comes after." He looked at each of them in turn, Miriam with her folder and her glasses, Sirius with his arms crossed and his complicated eyes, Dumbledore with his affection and his long game. "I'd like to go outside." They let him. The back garden of Sirius's flat was not a grand location for something unprecedented. It had the single garden chair, the patchy grass, the fence with the neighbor's cat that came and went, and Petunia's flower bed still doing the lean that had become so established it was now apparently permanent. October had stripped the colors to brown and gold and the pale blue of the sky overhead. Harry stood in the middle of the grass in his socks. He'd forgotten to put shoes on, and nobody had mentioned it, and just stood. The tide inside him was moving faster now. Not alarmingly faster, but he could feel the acceleration the way you feel a river before you reach the turn where the current picks up. Still smooth, still patient, just more. He was aware of Sirius at the doorway. He was aware of Miriam running a continuous diagnostic from the kitchen window, instruments on the sill, recording everything. He was aware of Dumbledore in the kitchen being respectfully still, which was its own kind of consideration. He thought about the beetle. 3 years ago, he'd been 7, just been 7. He'd levitated that beetle in this garden with the carefulness of someone testing a new thing. Let it down gently, looked at Sirius through the window. It had felt, that day, like discovering the first word of a language he was going to spend his whole life learning. This felt like finishing the first sentence. He put his hands at his sides and opened up his awareness, the thing Miriam called exteroception, the sense he'd been developing for 3 years of his own magical field, its boundary, its quality, its movement. He'd gotten good at it. He could feel the radius of it now without thinking, roughly 6 feet in every direction, the shimmer that Sirius watched for and Miriam measured. He let it expand. Just let the door open wider the way he'd always thought about it. Let the space enlarge. The shimmer pushed outward past the garden fence, past the wall into the street beyond. He could feel it touching things, the cold metal of the fence, the roots of Petunia's roses, the actual structure of the earth under his feet, which had a slow, deep vibration that he'd never felt before because he'd never reached this far. Inside his bones, everything moved faster. "Harry," Miriam said from the window, her voice very controlled, "your core reading has just left the Bessemer instrument's range." "I know," he said. "What does that mean?" Sirius's voice quieter. "It means the instrument only goes to 25, Miriam said. "And we're past that." Harry closed his eyes. He didn't need them for this part. The tide reached its crest. He felt it, the specific moment of it, exact and unmistakable, the way Lily Potter had built the exact moment of it after designing the everything before and the everything after. The 400 curses, each one distinct in his bones, each one a different ancient dark thing that had been slowly converting for 10 years, reached simultaneously the end of their conversion. Not a dramatic ending, a completion, like the last note of something enormously long played to its resolution, and then like scaffolding coming down cleanly all at once they dissolved, not painfully, not violently. The way morning fog dissolves in the specific kind of October sun that's doing its best. They were there, and then they were not there as separate things, and what remained was what they'd been building, which was him, which had always been him, now fully himself in a way he couldn't have been before. Something enormous moved through him from the ground up. The garden did something. Every plant in Petunia's flower bed stood straight up. The lean vanished, not because Harry had stopped affecting them, but because he was now everywhere rather than pulling from one direction, so there was no gradient, just an even presence that extended in all directions simultaneously. The grass under his feet was very green and very awake feeling. The neighbor's cat, who had been on the fence, sat very straight and looked at him with the serious attention that cats brought to things that exceeded their usual categories. The shimmer was gone, not diminished, gone, because what had been a field with a boundary was now simply how far his awareness went, which was, he discovered, testing carefully, considerably further than 6 feet. He opened his eyes. He looked at the morning sky, October blue, and felt the extraordinary and simple fact of being 10 years old and entirely himself, and his mother's work finished inside him and his father's stubbornness running through his blood and 400 ancient dark things converted into this, which was not a weapon, and was not a symbol, and was not the chosen one or the boy who lived or any of the things other people had been constructing out of his name. It was just him, just Harry. The screen door behind him opened. Sirius came out into the garden and stood beside him and looked at him for a long moment. "Well," he said. "It's done," Harry said. "How do you feel?" Harry thought about this with the thoroughness he always brought to Sirius's questions, which deserved real answers. "Like myself," he said. "Exactly like myself." "More so?" He paused. "It's hard to explain. Like before, there was this thing happening inside me that I could feel but couldn't fully inhabit because it wasn't finished yet. Like a room that's being built, and now it's finished and I can just live in it." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face that he let move, which was unusual for him. He usually kept the larger feelings under the surface, deployable on his terms. But he let this one. "She got it right," he said. "She got it exactly right," Harry said. Sirius made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He put one hand on the back of Harry's neck briefly, the way he sometimes did, quick, certain, not sentimental but entirely real, and then took it away. "Miriam is going to want to run every diagnostic she owns," he said. "I know. Dumbledore is going to want to talk. I know. Augusta is going to hear about this and descend like a natural disaster in very good robes." Harry laughed. "Real and easy out in the October air. Also probably Voss," he said. "God help us," Sirius said. "Yes, probably Voss." Miriam's diagnostics took 4 hours. Harry sat in the examination circle in the upstairs room, the chalked floorboards, the instruments on the shelf, the modified shielding on the walls, and let her run everything she had. All of it in sequence, the full battery that she'd been building toward his whole life. He sat still and answered her questions and told her precisely what he felt during each scan, which was the thing she'd always said was as important as the numerical data. The subjective experience, mapped alongside the objective reading. The results dismantled most of her existing models and confirmed the theoretical framework she'd been building for 6 years, which was its own kind of satisfaction. The curses were gone, not suppressed, not dormant, gone, no residue, no signature, nothing remaining in his skeletal structure that registered as dark magic. Where the diagnostic had been showing 400 distinct dark curse structures for 10 years, it was now showing normal bone. Healthy, dense, entirely unremarkable bone. What was not unremarkable was everything else. "Your magical core reading," Miriam said, looking at the Bessemer instrument and then at the considerably more arcane device she'd sourced from Prague 6 months ago specifically against the possibility that the Bessemer wouldn't be enough, she paused. "I need to reframe how I'm describing this." She looked at him. "The standard framework measures magical density on a scale. That's the wrong metaphor for what's happening with you. It's not that your core is very dense. It's that your core doesn't have a boundary." Harry looked at her. "Normal magical cores have a defined edge," she said. "You can map where the person's magical field ends. There's an inside and an outside." She gestured at the instruments. "Your field doesn't end within instrument range." A pause. "We'd need to move the instruments considerably farther away to even locate the boundary. And I don't think, Harry, I don't think a boundary of the standard type exists anymore. The integration your mother's architecture accomplished has," she started again, choosing precision over speed. "Your magic isn't stored in you. It is you. You're the core. Your biological and magical structures are fully integrated in a way that shouldn't be physically possible and that I am going to be writing about until I die." "But I'm healthy," Harry said. "You are spectacularly healthy," she said. "Your biological systems are the most robustly functional I have ever assessed." She set down her quill. "Your mother's architecture was extraordinarily careful, Harry. It didn't just convert the dark magic. It used the conversion energy to optimize everything it touched on the way through. Your bones, your neurological function, your magical pathways, all of it built on 10 years of continuously converted dark energy passing through and strengthening as it went." She looked at him steadily. "You're not a child who survived something terrible. You're a person who was built very deliberately and very lovingly out of something terrible." Harry sat with this. "She knew it would take the whole 10 years, he said. "She designed a 10-year process and she never got to see any of it." Miriam's voice was very careful. "No, she didn't." He looked at his hands. They looked the same as they always had. He'd half expected them to look different, some visible sign of the thing that had completed. They were just his hands. The magic was there if he reached for it, smooth and enormous and entirely comfortable, like a room he'd always lived in that he now understood fully. "Do you know what wandless magic feels like for most people?" he said. "Describe it," Miriam said, because she always said describe it. "Like lifting something heavy," he said. "I've read the literature on it. It takes effort and concentration and it depletes core reserves quickly. It gets easier with practice, but it's never not effortful." He looked at his hands. "For me, it's like breathing, not effortful, just available. The intention and the magic are the same thing." "Yes," Miriam said. "I thought that was where it was heading. How long have you known? Known specifically today?" She smiled briefly, and it was the genuine one she kept mostly for Harry-related diagnostic discoveries. "Suspected, about 2 years." "You could have told me. I told you everything I was certain of," she said. "Everything else I told you I suspected. I think that's the correct approach with a child's medical care." She paused. "Don't you?" He thought about it. "Yes," he admitted. "It is." Dumbledore found him in the garden again that evening. Sirius was inside cooking dinner with the philosophical chaos approach, something involving chicken and rather too many herbs, and Miriam had gone home 3 hours ago with enough diagnostic data to keep her writing for months. The October dark had fully arrived, and the garden was that particular cold, clear black that happened when clouds stayed away, and the stars above Privet Drive were doing what stars did when nobody was paying attention to them, which was everything. Dumbledore came out and stood beside Harry and looked up as well. He said nothing for a moment, which Harry appreciated. He noticed that Dumbledore's silences were deliberate. He was a man who could speak at length on virtually any subject and chose not to regularly, which meant the silences had something in them. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. Harry waited. Not for protecting you, Dumbledore said. I won't apologize for that because it was necessary, and the blood wards on Petunia's house have kept things from you that you may not fully appreciate yet. But for the way I protected you, he paused. I made decisions about your life, major, significant decisions about where you would live and who would know what and how information about you would be managed, without your knowledge, without your input, and with the implicit assumption that you were a piece in a larger game that needed careful handling. He was quiet for a moment. You were never a piece. I should have understood that earlier than I did. Harry looked at the stars. He thought about what Sirius had told him about Dumbledore, what Miriam had told him. What Augusta Longbottom had said once with the precise tartness she deployed when making points she considered self-evident. Albus Dumbledore is the best man in Britain, and that is precisely why someone should always be watching him. I know why you did it, Harry said. I'm not angry, he paused. I'm also not going to pretend it was right. No, Dumbledore said, it wasn't. And going forward, Harry said, I'll make my own decisions about what access people have to me and what I do with what I am. Yes, Dumbledore said, you should. That includes Hogwarts, Harry said. I want to go. That part of your plan is fine. He looked at Dumbledore sideways. But I'm not going to be the student you have in mind. I'm not going to perform being unremarkable for the sake of not frightening people. I would never ask you to, Dumbledore said, and there was a warmth in it and also something careful, a man making a promise while quietly revising his own expectations. You were going to ask me to, Harry said, not unkindly. A pause. Perhaps I was considering whether to suggest some degree of restraint, Dumbledore said, which was close enough to honest that Harry accepted it. I understand the argument for restraint, Harry said. Voss made it. You would have made it. The argument is that very few people can handle knowing what I am, and it's safer for everyone if I don't make it obvious. He turned to face Dumbledore. But that argument is also exactly the argument that kept me in the dark about my own bones for the first 6 years of my life, and I've decided I don't trust it anymore. Dumbledore looked at him. The pale winter starlight was doing interesting things to the silver of his hair, and his eyes behind the half-moon glasses had that quality they sometimes had of being simultaneously amused and entirely serious. You're 10 years old, he said. Yes, Harry said, and I understand the architecture of my own magic better than anyone else alive, and I understand what my mother built and why she built it. And I understand that the wizarding world thinks I'm a symbol and that symbols need managing. He looked up at the stars again. I'm not a symbol. Symbols don't have mothers. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. No, he said softly, they don't. That night, lying in bed listening to Sirius's flat settle into its nighttime sounds, Harry put one hand flat on his chest over his sternum and paid attention. Nothing moved in his bones. No tide, no vibration, no deep mechanism rotating. Just his heartbeat and his breathing and the vast quiet of something completed. The absence of the architecture wasn't empty, it was full. He could feel the magic the way you feel your own hands, everywhere at once, constant and familiar and entirely unremarkable in the way that the most fundamental things about yourself become unremarkable. He thought about what he was going to do with a year. Study, certainly. He had a list. Miriam had given him access to her full research library 3 months ago, and he'd been working through it systematically. He wanted to start on formal curse theory before September. Understanding the academic framework for what he'd been living would be more useful than discovering it all for the first time in a defense classroom. He wanted to push the wandless work further, understand its limits, find them and then work on moving them. He thought about Voss, who would be making contact properly through Miriam's office within the week. The department research was genuinely interesting. The relationship was manageable as long as Harry managed it, which he would. He thought about the 401st element, the love that had initiated everything. The choice his mother had made in the last moments she'd had, pouring herself into architecture for a child who wouldn't remember her. He pressed his palm harder against his chest. Thank you, he thought, to Lily Potter, who he had never met and would never meet, and who had nonetheless been with him every moment of his life, working, building, converting dark things into light things inside his bones. I'll do something good with it. He meant it the way he meant most things, completely, practically, with a full understanding of the cost, not a promise made to comfort himself. A statement of intention by a person who understood what he was capable of and had decided what to do with it. Outside, the October wind came through the gap under the window he always left slightly open, and the curtains moved, and somewhere down the street a fox went about its business, and Privet Drive was exactly itself in the middle of the night. Harry closed his eyes. He was 10 years old. He was exactly what his mother had built him to be, which was also exactly what he'd built himself to be, which was also not finished, because nothing worth being was finished at 10. He was strong in a way that no scale had a number for. He was clear in a way that came from 10 years of Sirius Black telling him to say what he thought, and Miriam Thorne teaching him to be precise, and the steady quiet of his own mind working through things the way it always had, directly, without drama, without hiding. He was not afraid of Hogwarts. He was not afraid of Voldemort's name or Voldemort's legacy or the thing that Dumbledore believed was coming back. He was not afraid of Voss or the Ministry or the wizarding world's need to make him into something it could use. He was not afraid of himself, which was perhaps the rarest and most significant thing, to be 10 years old and entirely comfortable inside your own strange, unprecedented, architecturally extraordinary skin. He fell asleep in the ordinary way, the way 10-year-olds fell asleep, completely and quickly. And in the morning there would be breakfast and Sirius, and the topology book he still hadn't finished, and the question of whether the neighbor's cat was going to let him see what it did if he tried the focusing technique on something that wasn't a beetle. And eventually Hogwarts. And eventually everything else. The night held him and he slept, and in the morning he would be exactly the same person he'd been today, just himself, fully himself, 401 elements collapsed into one, which was plenty, which was, in fact, more than enough.